I still can't believe what happened that day in January 1984. It's been almost 40 years, but the memory is as vivid as ever. I was just a kid then, only 10 years old, living in Breathitt County, Kentucky. My best friend Tommy and I were always exploring the woods near our homes, looking for adventure. That winter was particularly cold, with temperatures dropping well below freezing for weeks on end. The creek that ran through the forest behind our houses had frozen solid, creating a natural ice rink that we loved to slide around on. On that fateful day, Tommy and I decided to follow the creek deeper into the woods than we'd ever gone before. The ice was thick and solid under our feet, allowing us to venture much farther than usual. We slid along, laughing and racing each other, our breaths forming little clouds in the frigid air. As we rounded a bend in the creek, something caught my eye that made me skid to a stop. There, clearly visible on the pristine surface of the ice, was a set of footprints unlike anything I'd ever seen before. "Tommy, look at this!" I called out, pointing at the strange tracks. He slid over and crouched down to examine them more closely. "What the heck made those?" he wondered aloud. The footprints were small, maybe about the size of a child's foot, but they were unmistakably barefoot. We could clearly see the outline of a heel, the ball of the foot, and 5 distinct toes. But there was something off about them. The proportions seemed slightly wrong somehow, not quite human. "Let's follow them," Tommy said excitedly. I was more hesitant, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed. We carefully made our way along the frozen creek, following the bizarre footprints. They continued for about 20 feet, consisting of 6 clear impressions in the ice. What was truly baffling was the stride length. Whatever made these prints was taking huge steps, much bigger than you'd expect for such small feet. The tracks led us to the creek bank, where they continued up an incredibly steep, almost vertical slope. Tommy and I looked at each other in disbelief. How could anything climb up there, especially barefoot in this freezing weather? Against my better judgment, we decided to try following the prints up the hillside. It was slow going. We had to dig our fingers into the frozen earth to pull ourselves up. About halfway up, I slipped and started to slide back down. Tommy grabbed my arm just in time, hauling me back up. My heart was pounding as I clung to the hillside, suddenly very aware of how high up we were. When we finally reached the top, panting and shaking, the footprints continued into the dense forest. The bare ground was dusted with a thin layer of snow, and the small barefoot prints stood out starkly against the white. "Should we keep going?" Tommy asked, an edge of nervousness in his voice now. I hesitated, torn between curiosity and a growing sense of unease. Something about this whole situation felt very wrong, but in the end, the mystery was too compelling to resist. "Yeah, let's see where they go," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. We pushed our way through the underbrush, following the trail deeper into the woods. The trees grew thicker, blocking out more and more of the weak winter sunlight. An eerie silence settled over everything. No birds calling, no squirrels scampering about. It was as if all the animals had vacated the area. After about 10 minutes of hiking, we came to a small clearing. The footprints led straight to the center and then abruptly vanished. It was if whatever made them had simply disappeared into thin air. Tommy and I stood there, bewildered. "Where did they go?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth to reply when a twig snapped loudly somewhere behind us. We both whirled around, hearts racing. "Hello!" I called out shakily. "Is anyone there?" No response, just that oppressive silence. Then we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Tommy," I whispered urgently, "I think we need to get out of here, now." He nodded, eyes wide with fear. We turned to leave the clearing when movement caught my eye. There, just within the tree line, I saw something that still haunts my nightmares to this day. It was a creature, roughly man-sized but definitely not human. Its body was covered in shaggy reddish-brown fur. But it was the face that truly terrified me. A twisted, ape-like visage with glowing yellow eyes that fixed us with an intelligent, predatory stare. For a split second, we all stood frozen, Tommy and I paralyzed with fear, the creature seemingly assessing us. Then it let out a blood-curdling shriek and started to move towards us with terrifying speed. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Tommy's arm and yanking him into motion. We tore through the forest in blind panic, branches whipping our faces as we ran. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind us, getting closer by the second. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but pure adrenaline kept me going. We burst out of the tree line near the top of the hill where we'd climbed up earlier. Without hesitation, we half ran, half slid down the steep slope, barely keeping our footing. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was at the top of the hill, its yellow eyes locked onto us. Hitting the frozen creek, we scrambled and slipped across the ice. The sound of breaking branches told me the thing was sliding down the hill after us. Somehow we made it to the other side and kept running, not daring to look back again. We didn't stop until we reached Tommy's backyard, collapsing onto the snow-covered grass, gasping for air. For several minutes we just lay there, too winded to speak. Finally, Tommy managed to choke out, "What? What was that thing?" I shook my head, still trying to process what we'd seen. "I don't know. But those footprints, they must have been its." We eventually gathered ourselves enough to go inside and tell Tommy's parents what happened. They were skeptical at first, assuming we were making up stories. But something in our eyes must have convinced them we truly believed what we were saying. Tommy's dad called the sheriff's department, and a deputy came out to take our statement. He seemed to take us seriously, jotting down notes as we described the footprints and the creature. He said they'd send someone out to investigate the area the next day. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing yellow eyes staring at me. I kept imagining I heard that inhuman shriek outside my window. The next morning, Tommy's dad drove us out to meet the deputies at the creek. But when we got there, any evidence of our encounter was gone. The warm spell that had moved in overnight had melted the ice on the creek, erasing the strange footprints. The hillside showed no signs of our frantic climb or descent. We led the deputies to the clearing where we'd seen the creature, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate anything unusual had happened. I could tell they were starting to doubt our story. "Look, boys," one of the deputies said kindly, "I know you think you saw something yesterday, but there are no bears in this area, and certainly no apes. You were probably just scared by a deer or something and your imaginations ran wild. It happens to the best of us sometimes. But I knew what we'd seen. That was no deer. The glowing eyes, the inhuman shriek, the way it moved. It was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist." In the weeks that followed, Tommy and I tried to convince people of what we'd encountered. We even went to the local newspaper, but they just ran a small, humorous piece about kids with wild imaginations. Eventually, we stopped talking about it altogether. People either didn't believe us or thought we were crazy. But I know the truth. Something inhuman was in those woods that day. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, lurking in the forests of Kentucky. And on dark nights when the wind howls through the trees, I find myself lying awake, straining my ears for the sound of that terrible shriek once more. Story 2. Growing up, my mom always told me about these strange experiences she had as a kid. Her family lived in this old farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest. According to her, my great-grandmother had this weird habit of leaving buckets of food scraps out on the back porch at night. When my mom asked why, her grandma would just say it was for the hairy men. As a kid, I thought it was just some crazy old lady superstition. But my mom swore up and down that one night when she was about 8 years old, she saw something that made her a believer. It was a cool autumn evening, and my mum was staying up late reading in bed. Her window overlooked the back porch and the wooded hillside beyond. Around midnight she heard a noise outside and peeked out the window. What she saw next made her blood run cold. There, lumbering down the hill, was a massive hair-covered figure. It walked on 2 legs like a man, but was completely covered in thick brown fur. As it got closer to the porch, she could make out more details. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. The creature went straight for the bucket of food scraps my great-grandmother had left out. It picked up the entire bucket with one hand and carried it over to the old well a few yards from the porch. Then it just sat down, right there in the moonlight, and started eating. My mum said she was frozen in terror, unable to look away. The thing methodically ate every scrap of food, occasionally pausing to sniff the air. When it was done, it stood up, stretched, and loped back into the forest without a sound. I always found her story fascinating, if a bit hard to believe, but I never in a million years thought I'd have my own encounter with whatever she saw that night. Fast forward to last summer. I had just gone through a bad breakup and decided to get away for a while. My mum suggested I stay at the old family farmhouse. It had been vacant for years, but was still in the family. I figured some time alone in nature would do me good. The first few days were uneventful. I hiked during the day, read books in the evenings, and generally enjoyed the solitude. But on the 4th night, everything changed. I was up late watching an old horror movie, probably not the best choice given the setting. Around 1 a.m. I heard a noise outside that made me jump. It sounded like heavy footsteps on the back porch. My heart started racing immediately. I tried to tell myself it was just a raccoon or something, but deep down, I knew it was too loud for that. I muted the TV and crept over to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything, but as my eyes adjusted, I made out a large, dark shape moving near the edge of the woods. It was hard to tell in the dim moonlight, but it looked huge, and not shaped quite right to be a bear or any other animal I could think of. I watched, paralyzed, as the figure slowly made its way closer to the house. As it entered a patch of moonlight, I had to stifle a scream. It was exactly like my mom had described, a massive, fur-covered humanoid creature. In the silvery light, I could see muscles rippling under the thick brown hair covering its entire body. My mind was reeling. This couldn't be real, but there it was, right in front of me. The creature paused at the edge of the porch, its head swiveling back and forth as if scanning for danger. Then it took another step forward. In that moment, pure instinct took over. I dove away from the window and scrambled across the room, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. I ended up grabbing a heavy brass lamp from the bedside table. For what felt like an eternity, I crouched there in the darkness, clutching the lamp and straining my ears for any sound. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure the thing outside must be able to hear it. After a few minutes of silence, I worked up the courage to peek out the window again. The porch was empty. I scanned the tree line, but saw no sign of movement. Had I imagined the whole thing? Just as I was starting to calm down, I heard a loud thump from the roof directly above me. Then another, and another. It was walking around up there. I bolted for the bedroom door, fumbling with the lock in my panic. As I ran down the hallway, I could hear the creaking of the roof beams under the creature's weight. It seemed to be pacing back and forth, as if searching for a way in. I made it to the kitchen and grabbed my car keys from the counter. Just as I reached for the back door, I heard a new sound that made my blood turn to ice, the scrape of claws against the bedroom window upstairs. It was trying to get in. Without thinking, I flung open the door and sprinted for my car. I had just reached the driver's side door when I heard a deafening crash from inside the house. The thing had broken through the window. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, a massive, shadowy form bursting out the back door of the house. I slammed the car into drive and peeled out down the long gravel driveway, spitting rocks behind me. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creature bound across the yard with inhuman speed. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it would catch up to the car, but as I fishtailed onto the main road, it stopped at the edge of the property and let out a bone-chilling roar that echoed through the night. I drove for hours, too terrified to stop. It wasn't until the sun started to rise that I finally pulled over at a rest stop, my hands cramping from gripping the steering wheel so tight. As the adrenaline faded, I broke down sobbing. I called my mom later that day and told her everything. She believed me without hesitation and apologized for ever letting me stay at that house alone. We both agreed to never go back there. It's been almost a year now, and I still have nightmares about that night. I've done some research since then on Bigfoot and other cryptid sightings in the area. While I've found some similar accounts, nothing quite matches what I experienced. Part of me still wonders if I somehow imagined or hallucinated the whole thing, but then I remember the pure, primal terror I felt, the kind you can only experience when facing something your brain tells you shouldn't exist. Whatever I saw that night was real, and it's still out there. I don't know why it came to the house that night, or why it seemed so intent on getting inside. Was it just curious, hungry, or did it have more sinister intentions? I'll probably never know for sure. But one thing's certain, I'll never look at the woods the same way again. Story 3. It started out like any other hunting trip. I grabbed my trusty shotgun and headed out into the woods near our property. The air was crisp, leaves just starting to turn. I remember the crunch of twigs under my boots as I made my way deeper into the forest. I'd been out there for a couple hours, moving slowly and quietly, scanning for any sign of game. That's when I heard it, a commotion in the underbrush ahead. At first I thought I'd stumbled upon a deer, but as I crept closer, I realized the sounds were all wrong. There was growling, snarling. It sounded like a fight. My heart started racing as I approached, shotgun at the ready. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of movement, something big and dark. My first thought was that it must be a bear. We didn't get many in the area, but it wasn't unheard of. As I got closer, I realized one of the animals involved was a dog. I recognized it as belonging to our neighbor, old Mr. Johnson. The dog was going crazy, lunging and snapping at something much larger. That's when I got my first clear look at what it was fighting, and my blood ran cold. This was no bear. The creature towered over the dog, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark, matted fur. But what struck me most was how human-like its body shape was. It stood on 2 legs, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. The rational part of my brain kept trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just a really big guy in a costume. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. This thing moved with a fluid, animal grace. No human could move like that. For a moment, I just stood there in shock, watching as the creature battered away the dog's attacks like they were nothing. Its movements were so fast, so powerful. The dog didn't stand a chance. Then, as if sensing my presence, the creature suddenly stopped and turned its head in my direction. Our eyes met, and in that moment, time seemed to stand still. Its eyes were dark and intelligent, far too knowing to belong to any animal I'd ever encountered. A primal fear gripped me, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from those eyes. They seemed to stare right through me, like the creature was looking into my very soul. That's when it let out a sound I'll never forget, as long as I live. It wasn't quite a roar, wasn't quite a scream. It was something in between, filled with rage and challenge. The sound reverberated through the trees, seeming to shake the very ground beneath my feet. That broke the spell. Panic exploded through me and I turned and ran, dropping my shotgun in my haste to get away. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, but I barely felt them. All I could think about was putting as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. My lungs were on fire, legs burning, but the fear kept me going. I was convinced at any moment I'd feel a hand grab me from behind, yanking me back into those woods. When I finally burst out of the tree line onto our property, I was sobbing and gasping for air. My mom came running out of the house, asking what was wrong. I tried to explain between gulping breaths, but I'm sure I wasn't making much sense. I begged her not to make me go back into the woods. She must have seen the genuine terror in my eyes, because she didn't push the issue. She just brought me inside and tried to calm me down. Over the next few days, as the shock wore off, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it had just been a bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe the fear had made me imagine things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I'd seen that day wasn't any known animal. I never told anyone the full story. Who would believe me? I'd be laughed out of town, branded as the kid who cried Bigfoot. So I kept it to myself, pushing the memory down and trying to forget. But I never went hunting again after that day. I couldn't bring myself to go back into those woods. Even now, decades later, I get nervous around forests. The sound of twigs snapping in the underbrush makes my heart race. For years I've scoured the internet, looking for similar stories. I've found a few, other people who've had encounters they can't explain. It helps, knowing I'm not alone. But it also scares me, thinking about what might really be out there in the wilderness. I still live in Kentucky, but I moved away from Greenup County as soon as I was old enough. I couldn't stand being so close to those woods, always wondering if that creature was still out there. Sometimes I think about going back, trying to find some evidence to prove I'm not crazy. But then I remember those eyes, that roar, and the terror comes flooding back. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't know if it was a Bigfoot or some other unknown creature. All I know is that it was real, and it changed my life forever. I can still see it so clearly in my mind, the matted fur, the powerful limbs, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers me too. If somewhere out in those Kentucky forests, that creature is still roaming, still challenging anyone who dares to enter its territory. And on dark nights, when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I swear I can almost hear that bone-chilling roar echoing in the distance. I know this story sounds crazy. If someone had told me this before it happened, I wouldn't have believed them either. But I swear on everything I hold dear, every word is true. I saw something that day in those woods, something that shouldn't exist. And not a day goes by that I don't think about it, wondering what else might be out there that we don't understand. To this day, I've never fully gotten over what happened. I still have nightmares sometimes, where I'm back in those woods, face to face with that creature. I wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, half expecting to see those dark eyes staring at me from the shadows of my room. I've tried therapy, tried medication, but nothing seems to fully erase the memory. It's like that encounter left a permanent mark on my psyche. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, always on edge in wooded areas. The worst part is the not knowing what exactly I saw, not knowing if anyone would ever believe me, not knowing if I'd ever encounter something like that again. It's a weight I've carried for over 30 years now, and I'm not sure I'll ever be free of it. I've thought about going to the media or to scientists, but what proof do I have? Just the ramblings of a man who saw something strange as a teenager. Without evidence, I'd be dismissed as a crackpot or attention seeker. So I've kept it to myself all these years, letting it eat away at me. Writing this out now, I feel a mix of relief and fear. Relief at finally sharing my story, but fear of the memories it's dredging up. Fear of being judged or ridiculed, but mostly fear of that creature. Even after all this time, the thought of it still terrifies me to my core. I don't know if sharing this will help me find peace, or if it will just open old wounds, but I knew I had to get it out somehow. If nothing else, maybe it will serve as a warning to others. Be careful out there in the wilderness. There are things in this world we don't understand, things that defy explanation, and sometimes ignorance really is bliss. Story 4. I still can't shake the memory of what happened that October back in 1990. I was 15 years old at the time, living in Hopkins County, Kentucky. My dad and I loved to go hunting together. It was our special father-son bonding time. But that fall, our usual hunting trips took a terrifying turn that I'll never forget. It all started on a crisp Saturday morning. Dad woke me up before dawn, and we headed out to our favorite spot in the woods. The air was cool and misty as we made our way through the trees, fallen leaves crunching under our boots. Everything seemed normal at first, just another day in the forest. We set up in our usual spot and settled in to wait quietly for any deer to pass by. After a couple uneventful hours, I started to get restless. I whispered to Dad that I was going to walk around a bit to stretch my legs. He nodded and told me not to go too far. I wandered maybe 100 yards away, taking in the peaceful autumn scenery. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. A thunderous pounding, almost like giant footsteps, mixed with the crashing of branches. My heart started racing as I tried to figure out what could possibly make a sound like that. Then came the screams, horrible, inhuman shrieks that echoed through the trees. They didn't sound like any animal I knew, too deep and guttural to be a bobcat or coyote, but with an almost human-like quality that sent chills down my spine. I stood frozen in place, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I was hearing. The sounds seemed to be moving, circling around me. Panic started to set in as I realized I had no idea which direction to run. Just as I was about to bolt, my dad came crashing through the underbrush, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered urgently. I nodded, unable to speak. Without another word, he grabbed my arm and we hurried back to the truck. The whole way home, we didn't say a word, just exchanged wide-eyed glances, both of us trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about those sounds. I scoured the internet and library books, trying to find any animal that could make noises like that. But nothing seemed to fit. Dad and I talked about it a bit, but neither of us could come up with a logical explanation. Part of me wanted to just forget the whole thing. But another part of me was filled with a burning curiosity. What was out there in those woods? A week later, against my better judgment, I convinced Dad to take me hunting again. He was hesitant, but I think he was just as curious as I was to figure out what had happened. We went to a different spot this time, about a mile from where we'd been before. The day started out uneventfully. We saw a few deer in the distance, but nothing close enough for a clean shot. As the afternoon wore on, I started to relax. Maybe last week had just been some freak occurrence, a bear maybe, or some kind of weird echo. But then, as the sun was starting to dip low in the sky, I saw something that turned my world upside down. I was scanning the tree line with my binoculars when I noticed some movement in a clump of bushes about 50 yards away. At first I thought it was just a deer, but as I watched, something massive began to rise up from behind the foliage. My jaw dropped as a huge brown hair-covered figure slowly stood to its full height. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. Its broad shoulders and muscular arms were unmistakably ape-like, but it stood upright on 2 legs like a man. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just stared in shock as this impossible creature took a few lumbering steps forward, its movement surprisingly graceful for its size. Its head swiveled from side to side, as if scanning its surroundings. A twig snapped under my foot, and its head whipped in my direction. For a split second, our eyes met. They were deep-set and intelligent, far too intelligent for any normal animal. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. The creature's lips pulled back in what looked almost like a grimace, revealing yellowed teeth. Then, with surprising speed for its bulk, it turned and strode into the deeper woods, quickly vanishing among the trees. I stood there trembling for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. Eventually, I managed to tear my eyes away from where the creature had disappeared and looked around wildly for my dad. He was about 30 yards to my left, staring slack-jawed in the same direction. Did you see that?" I finally croaked out. He nodded slowly, his face ashen. "I saw it. God help me, I saw it." We practically ran back to the truck, both of us rambling almost incoherently about what we'd witnessed. It was as if saying it out loud might make it less real somehow. But we both knew what we'd seen. On the drive home, the shock started to wear off, and the implications began to sink in. We'd seen a Bigfoot. An actual, living, breathing Bigfoot. Everything I thought I knew about the world suddenly seemed uncertain. Dad and I talked for hours that night, trying to make sense of it all. Should we tell someone? Would anyone even believe us? In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves. We knew how crazy it would sound. Hell, if someone had told me this story a week ago, I would have thought they were nuts. In the days and weeks that followed, I became obsessed with researching Bigfoot sightings and theories. I scoured every book and website I could find, looking for anything that might explain what we'd encountered. But the more I read, the more questions I had. Dad and I went back to those woods a few times after that, hoping to catch another glimpse or find some kind of evidence. But we never saw anything out of the ordinary again. It was like the creature had simply vanished into thin air. As the years have passed, I've often wondered if I imagined the whole thing. But then, I remember the look in my dad's eyes that day, and I know it was real. We saw something that defied explanation, something that most people believe is just a myth. I'm 48 now, with kids of my own. I've never told them about what happened that day. How could I? But sometimes when we're out in the woods, I catch myself scanning the trees, half expecting to see that massive figure emerge from the shadows. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what we encountered that October day in 1990. Was it some kind of undiscovered primate, an interdimensional being, a government experiment gone wrong? I've run through every possible explanation, but none of them quite fit. All I know for certain is that there are things in this world that we can't explain. Things that lurk just beyond the edge of what we think we know. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just catch a glimpse of them. I don't go hunting much anymore. The woods don't feel the same. There's always this sense of being watched, of something just out of sight. I can't shake the feeling that whatever we saw that day is still out there, waiting. Sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and dark, I swear I can hear those same thunderous footsteps and inhuman screams echoing in the distance. And I lie awake, wondering what other secrets the world is hiding, just beyond the veil of what we think is possible. Story 5. It was the summer of 2015, and my wife and I had decided to take a week-long camping trip in the lush forests of North Carolina. We'd been planning this getaway for months, eager to escape the hustle and bustle of city life and reconnect with nature. Little did I know that this trip would leave me questioning everything I thought I understood about the natural world. We arrived at our chosen campsite late in the afternoon. The air was thick with humidity, and the forest buzzed with the sounds of insects and birds. We set up our hammocks between two sturdy trees, about 15 feet apart. I always preferred hammocks to tents. They were more comfortable and gave me a better view of the surrounding forest. We cooked a simple dinner over our portable stove, chatting about our plans for the week ahead. As night fell, the forest came alive with a different kind of energy. The chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl created a peaceful ambiance. My wife and I settled into our separate hammocks, excited for a week of hiking, bird-watching, and simply enjoying nature. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember was jerking awake in the middle of the night. Something had disturbed my sleep, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. I lay still, listening intently to the sounds of the forest. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping nearby. At first, I dismissed it as probably just a deer or some other small animal, but then I heard another snap, closer this time, and another. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it was moving towards our campsite. I held my breath, straining my ears to catch any other sound. The forest had gone eerily quiet, as if all the other creatures were holding their breath too. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a deep, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a bear or a wolf or any other animal I was familiar with. This sound was different, primal, ancient. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. I wanted to call out to my wife, to make sure she was okay, but I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't want to draw attention to us if the creature hadn't noticed us yet. But it had noticed us. I could feel its presence, moving silently around our campsite. Occasionally, I'd hear the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves, but mostly it was silent. Too silent for something that big. Hours seemed to pass, though I had no way of knowing for sure. The creature circled our campsite, never coming too close, but never leaving either. It was as if it was studying us, trying to figure out what we were. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, I finally gathered enough courage to move. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my flashlight. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I clicked it on, sweeping the beam around our campsite. Nothing, but I knew it was still there. I could feel its eyes on me, watching from just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Desperate to do something, anything to protect us, I remembered an old trick I'd heard about marking territory. With shaking legs, I climbed out of my hammock and began to urinate around our campsite. It was a primal, instinctive action, born out of sheer terror. As I moved, I caught a glimpse of something in the shadows. It was tall, much taller than a man, and covered in dark fur. But it was the eyes that struck me, reflective and intelligent, watching my every move. I scrambled back to my hammock, my heart racing. The creature hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. It just watched. As the sky continued to lighten, I decided to try something else. I gathered a few small branches and threw them in the direction where I'd seen the creature. They clattered against the trees, breaking the eerie silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard it. the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, retreating deeper into the forest. The relief I felt was overwhelming but short-lived, because I knew deep down that it wasn't gone. It was just giving us space. When the sun finally rose, casting dappled light through the canopy, my wife stirred in her hammock. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked, yawning. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what had happened. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? So I just nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, fine," I lied. "Just some weird noises in the night. Probably a deer or something." We packed up our camp quickly, and I insisted we move to a different area of the forest. I told my wife I'd spotted some interesting bird species I wanted to observe, but the truth was, I couldn't bear to spend another night in that spot. For the rest of the trip, I was on edge. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those intelligent eyes watching us again. But we never saw or heard anything out of the ordinary for the remainder of our stay. When we finally returned home, I threw myself into research. I scoured scientific journals, cryptozoology forums, and local folklore, trying to find any explanation for what I had experienced. But nothing quite fit. The more I researched, the more questions I had. That night in Uwari National Forest changed me profoundly. As a biologist, I'd always prided myself on my rational, scientific approach to nature. But now I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew. What else was out there in the vast wilderness, unknown and undiscovered? I've never told anyone else about what happened that night. Who would believe me? A respected biologist claiming to have encountered some unknown creature in the woods of North Carolina. I'd be laughed out of academic circles. But I know what I experienced. I can still hear that deep, otherworldly growl. I can still feel those eyes watching me from the darkness. And I know that somewhere out there, in the depths of Uwari National Forest, there's a creature that defies our understanding of the natural world. I haven't been camping since that trip. The thought of spending a night in the woods fills me with a deep, primal fear. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself staring out into the darkness, wondering if somewhere out there, it's staring back at me. Story 6. I've been hunting for over 20 years, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that day in April 2007. It was supposed to be a routine turkey hunt in Lee County, Iowa. I'd been to those woods dozens of times before and knew the area like the back of my hand. But that day, something was different. Something was very wrong. I headed out before dawn, as usual. The air was crisp and cool, with just a hint of fog lingering between the trees. As I made my way deeper into the forest, I noticed how unusually quiet it was. No birds chirping, no small animals scurrying about. Just an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I found a good spot to set up and settled in to wait. As the sun slowly rose, casting long shadows through the trees, I stayed perfectly still, listening intently for any sign of turkey. But after a couple hours, I still hadn't heard so much as a peep. That's when the strange noises started. At first, it was just a faint, rhythmic thumping sound in the distance. Thump, thump, thump. It was oddly regular, almost mechanical sounding. My first thought was that maybe it was some kind of machinery from a nearby farm. But as it got louder, I realized it was definitely coming from within the forest. The thumping was getting closer, and now I could hear the snapping of branches and rustling of leaves accompanying it. Whatever was making that sound was big, and it was heading my way fast. My heart started racing. In all my years of hunting, I'd never encountered anything like this. I gripped my shotgun tightly, eyes darting back and forth, trying to pinpoint where the noise was coming from. That's when I saw it emerge from behind a thick cluster of trees about 50 yards away. I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. This thing was massive. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. It was walking on 2 legs, but in a bizarre, lumbering gait that was nothing like a human's. Its arms were impossibly long, nearly dragging on the ground as it moved. I was frozen in place, unable to move or even breathe as I watched this creature make its way through the forest. It hadn't seen me yet. I was well hidden in my blind. Part of me wanted to run screaming, but I knew any sudden movement would give away my position. As it got closer, I could make out more details. Its head was huge and oddly shaped, sitting directly on broad, sloping shoulders with barely any neck. The face was flat and ape-like, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The stench hit me next, an overwhelming odor of wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation. I had to fight the urge to gag. My mind was reeling, unable to process what I was seeing. This thing shouldn't exist. It couldn't exist. And yet here it was, less than 30 feet away from me now. Suddenly, it stopped. Its whole body went rigid, and slowly it turned its massive head in my direction. Those glowing eyes locked directly onto mine. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. I was utterly paralyzed with fear, staring into the eyes of something that defied explanation. I could see intelligence there, but also something wild and primal that sent chills down my spine. The creature's lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing yellowed, pointed teeth. A low growl rumbled from deep in its chest. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move a muscle. It took a lumbering step towards me, then another. I could see its muscles tensing, like it was preparing to charge. In a burst of adrenaline-fueled panic, I finally managed to move. I scrambled backwards out of my blind, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to get away. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. All I knew was that I had to get as far away from that thing as possible. Branches whipped at my face and I stumbled over roots, but I didn't slow down. I could hear it behind me, that rhythmic thumping getting louder and faster. It was chasing me. Oh God, it was chasing me, and it was gaining ground fast. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like lead, but sheer terror kept me going. I had no idea where I was or which direction I was running. The forest all looked the same in my panic. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst through the tree line into a small clearing. My truck was there. I'd never been so happy to see anything in my life. I sprinted the last few yards and practically dove into the driver's seat, fumbling with shaking hands to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life just as I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the clearing. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor, tires spinning in the mud before finding purchase. As I fishtailed onto the dirt road, I caught one last look in my rearview mirror. It was standing there at the edge of the trees, watching me go. Even from that distance, I could feel the weight of its gaze. Then, in the blink of an eye, it melted back into the shadows of the forest. I drove for hours, not even sure where I was going. I just knew I had to put as much distance between myself and those woods as possible. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but there was no making sense of it. Nothing in my experience could explain what that creature was. When I finally made it home, I was a mess, covered in scratches, clothes torn and muddy. My wife took one look at me and knew something was terribly wrong. But how could I even begin to explain? Who would believe me? I've never gone back to those woods. I gave up hunting altogether after that day. The memory of those glowing eyes and that inhuman snarl still haunts my nightmares. I don't know what that thing was. Bigfoot, some kind of mutant, a creature science hasn't discovered yet. All I know is that it was real, and it was terrifying beyond words. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, roaming those forests. Other times, I try to convince myself it was all just a vivid hallucination brought on by dehydration or something I ate. But deep down, I know the truth. I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that shattered my understanding of the world, and I'll never be the same because of it. I'm sharing this now because I need someone to believe me. I need to know I'm not crazy. That day in the woods changed everything for me. It opened my eyes to the fact that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows, just out of sight. So the next time you're in the woods and you hear something strange or feel like you're being watched, trust your instincts, because you never know what might be out there, waiting. Story 7. The first few days were uneventful. I'd set up a small camp about 8 miles in from the trailhead, deep in some of the densest old-growth forest you'll find anywhere. The weather was typical for that time of year, cool and damp, with a constant misty drizzle hanging in the air. Perfect conditions for stalking elk. On the 4th morning, I woke before dawn and set out, planning to work my way up to a ridge where I'd seen promising sign the day before. The forest was dead quiet as I picked my way through the undergrowth, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of moss and pine needles. I'd been moving for maybe an hour when I first got the sense that something was off. It's hard to explain, but the forest just felt different, tense, like the air before a thunderstorm. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, though I couldn't say why. It was nearing midday when I heard it, a sharp cracking sound, like a whip being snapped. I froze, my rifle halfway to my shoulder. For a second I thought it might be a branch breaking, but it was too sharp, too deliberate. And then I heard it again, closer this time, off to my left. I've encountered all kinds of wildlife in those woods, bears, cougars, you name it. But this was something else entirely. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there, but I was rooted to the spot, straining my ears. That's when I realized the forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just that eerie, oppressive quiet. And then, from somewhere behind me came another crack, and another. It was like they were surrounding me. I'd like to say I stood my ground, but the truth is, I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Something primal took over, and I just bolted. I crashed through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my ears. Those cracking sounds followed me, always just out of sight. Sometimes they seemed to be coming from the trees above me. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. My lungs were burning, and I was covered in scratches from pushing through the dense foliage. But the worst part was the feeling of being watched, hunted. I could sense something moving through the forest alongside me, keeping pace effortlessly. At one point, I burst into a small clearing and caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, rifle raised, but there was nothing there, just shadows and mist between the trees. But I swear I saw something, a massive, dark shape that seemed to shimmer and fade like a heat mirage. The cracking sounds were all around me now, a cacophony of whip-like snaps. It was like they were communicating, calling to each other. I realized with a jolt of terror that there had to be at least 3 or 4 of whatever they were. I don't remember much of what happened next. I just know I kept running, stumbling really, driven by blind panic. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what was happening. These things, whatever they were, seemed to be toying with me. They could have easily caught me if they wanted to, but instead, they herded me through the forest like a sheepdog with its flock. It wasn't until I literally fell out of the woods onto an old logging road that the sounds stopped. I lay there gasping for breath, expecting at any moment to feel massive hands grabbing me. But there was nothing, just the normal sounds of the forest slowly returning. I made it back to my campsite in record time, threw my gear in my truck, and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop driving until I was back in Carson, my hands shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. It's been over 25 years, and I've never told anyone the full story until now. I've racked my brain trying to come up with a rational explanation, but I keep coming back to one impossible conclusion. I stumbled into the territory of a family of creatures, things that shouldn't exist, things that could somehow make themselves invisible or close to it. I know how it sounds. Believe me, I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head. But I know what I experienced. Those sounds, that feeling of being watched and hunted, that glimpse of something massive and otherworldly. It was all real. I gave up hunting after that. Sold my gear, my guns, everything. I couldn't bear the thought of going back into those woods. Even now, all these years later, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of those whip-like cracks echoing in my ears. I don't know what's out there in the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, but I know there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that we're not meant to understand, and I know that I'll carry the memory of that day with me for the rest of my life. Story 8. We'd been chatting and joking around, trying to stay alert after a long day of work. Jake was behind the wheel of his old pickup truck, and I was riding shotgun. The heater was blasting to keep out the autumn chill. Suddenly, Jake let out this startled "whoa" and slammed on the brakes. I jolted forward, my seatbelt locking up. "What the hell, man?" I started to say, but the words died in my throat as I saw what Jake was staring at. There, illuminated in the headlights, was the biggest, most bizarre creature I've ever seen in my life. It was crossing the road right in front of us, maybe 30 feet ahead. At first glance, I thought it was a bear, but bears don't walk on two legs like that. This thing was massive, had to be at least 8 feet tall, probably closer to 9. And the way it moved, it was unsettling, smooth and fluid, almost graceful despite its bulk. As it turned slightly to look at us, I got a clear view of its face. It wasn't human, but it wasn't quite animal either. The eyes reflected red in our headlights, and I swear they locked right onto mine for a split second. I felt this primal jolt of fear shoot through me. The whole thing only lasted maybe 5 or 6 seconds, but time seemed to stretch out. I was taking in every detail I could. The creature was covered in dark, shaggy hair, not fur exactly, but not like human hair either. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging down past its knees, and the muscle definition was insane. You could see the play of powerful muscles under that hair as it moved. Just as quickly as it appeared, the thing loped off into the woods on the other side of the road. Jake and I sat there in stunned silence for a good 30 seconds. I think we were both trying to process what the hell we'd just seen. Finally, Jake turned to me with wide eyes and said, "Tell me you saw that too." His voice was shaky. "Yeah," I managed to croak out. What was that thing?" Jake just shook his head, still looking shell-shocked. "I don't know, man, but we need to get the hell out of here." He stomped on the gas, and we tore down that road like bats out of hell. My heart was racing, and I kept looking back over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing chasing after us. We didn't say much for the rest of the drive. What was there to say? We'd just seen something that shouldn't exist, something that flew in the face of everything I thought I knew about the world. When we got back to Grants Pass, Jake dropped me off at my place. As I was getting out of the truck, he grabbed my arm. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "We're not crazy, right? That really happened?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, it happened. I don't know what it was, but we both saw it." We agreed to meet up the next day to talk it over. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the image of that creature from my mind. Those eyes, that fluid movement, the sheer impossible size of it. I must have dozed off eventually, but my dreams were filled with dark forests and loping shadows. The next morning, I woke up hoping it had all been some vivid nightmare. But the moment I saw Jake's face when I met him for coffee, I knew it was real. We spent hours going over every detail we could remember, trying to make sense of it. Jake was convinced it was a Bigfoot. I wasn't so sure. I'd always thought Bigfoot was just a myth, something made up to sell tabloids. But after what we'd seen, I couldn't dismiss the idea outright anymore. We debated whether to report it to anyone. In the end, we decided against it. Who would believe us? We'd probably just end up labeled as a couple of kooks, maybe even lose our jobs if word got around. So we kept it to ourselves. But that experience changed something in me. I became obsessed with researching Bigfoot sightings, especially in southern Oregon. I found out that the area around Cave Junction has a long history of strange encounters. I started spending my weekends hiking in the Siskiyou National Forest, hoping to catch another glimpse of whatever it was we saw that night. I never did see it again, but there were times I felt like I was being watched. Little things, snapped branches, strange footprints, eerie silence falling over the forest. It's been over 20 years now, and I still think about that night all the time. Jake and I don't talk much anymore. I think the experience was too much for him. He moved away a couple years after it happened, said he couldn't stand being in the woods anymore. But me, I can't stay away. There's something out there in those forests, something that science can't explain. And even though it terrifies me, I'm drawn to it. I need to understand. I've never told anyone else about what we saw that night. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw. And I know that somewhere out there, in the deep forests of southern Oregon, there are creatures that defy explanation. Maybe someday I'll find proof. Until then, all I have are the memories of those few seconds on a dark road when my entire world view was shattered. I still work construction, but now I specialize in remote cabins and fire lookouts. Any chance I get to be out in those woods, I take it. Sometimes on quiet nights, I'll sit out on the porch of whatever cabin I'm working on and just listen to the forest. And every now and then, I'll hear something moving out there in the darkness. Something big. I don't know if I'll ever see that creature again. Part of me hopes I do, while another part is terrified at the thought. But one thing's for sure. I'll never forget that night in Josephine County. It changed everything for me. And I know that no matter how many people might scoff or roll their eyes, there are things out there in this world that we can't explain. I've seen one with my own eyes. So if you're ever driving those back roads near Cave Junction late at night, keep your eyes open. And if you see something impossible step out of the woods, well, just know you're not alone. There are others out here who've seen it too. We might not have proof, but we know what we saw, and we'll keep searching for answers, no matter how long it takes. Story 9. We'd been working all day, hauling lumber and tools through the dense forest. As the sun started to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees, Dad sent Tom and me to fetch some more nails from the truck. We were glad for the break and raced each other down the old logging road, kicking up leaves as we went. About halfway to the truck, we came to a clearing where the road widened out a bit. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me in the fading light. There, standing motionless at the edge of the road about 50 yards ahead, was the biggest, strangest creature I'd ever seen. My breath caught in my throat as I grabbed Tom's arm, pointing wordlessly. He froze mid-step, his eyes going wide as he followed my gaze. The thing was enormous. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. It was covered in dark, shaggy hair from head to toe, with arms that hung down past its knees. But what struck me most was its silhouette against the backdrop of the lake beyond. It was standing fully upright on 2 legs, but there was something undeniably inhuman about its proportions. The head seemed to sit directly on its broad shoulders, with no real neck to speak of. And those arms, They were held slightly away from its body, massive and powerful looking. For a split second, my mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear standing up. No, the stance was all wrong. Some kind of escaped gorilla. But we were in rural Oklahoma, not exactly known for its primate population. With a jolt of fear that went through me like an electric shock, I realized what we had to be looking at. A Bigfoot. I'd heard stories, of course. Everyone in these parts had. But I'd always assumed they were just tall tales, the kind of thing old-timers told around campfires to scare kids. Now, faced with the reality of this massive, hair-covered being, I felt a primal terror unlike anything I'd experienced before. Tom and I stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. The creature hadn't moved, but somehow I knew it was aware of us. I could feel its gaze on us, even though I couldn't make out any eyes in the gathering gloom. The whole forest seemed to have gone silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in this bizarre standoff. It could have been seconds or minutes. Time seemed to stretch and warp, like in a nightmare. I kept waiting for it to do something, to charge at us, to run away, anything, but it just stood there, as still as a statue, its massive form blocking the road ahead. Finally, Tom broke the spell. In a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he hissed, "Run, now!" I didn't need to be told twice. We turned as one and sprinted back up the road towards where we'd left Dad, our feet pounding the dirt in perfect synchronization. I didn't dare look back, terrified that I'd see the thing lumbering after us with impossible speed. The trees blurred past as we ran, branches whipping at our faces and arms. I could hear Tom's ragged breathing beside me, matching my own panicked gasps. We burst into the small clearing where Dad was still working on the deer stand, nearly colliding with him in our haste. He looked up, startled, as we skidded to a stop, both of us talking at once, trying to explain what we'd seen. Whoa, slow down," Dad said, grabbing our shoulders to steady us. "What's got you boys so spooked?" Tom, being older, managed to get the words out first. "There's something out there, Dad, on the road. It's huge and it's not normal." I nodded frantically, still trying to catch my breath. "It's a Bigfoot, Dad. I swear it is. We both saw it." Dad's expression changed from confusion to concern. He'd known us long enough to know we weren't the type to make up stories or play pranks, especially not with the fear so evident in our voices and faces. "Show me," he said simply, reaching for his rifle that was leaning against a nearby tree. With Dad between us, we made our way cautiously back down the road. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. The shadows seemed deeper now, full of hidden dangers. I kept expecting to see that massive hair-covered form step out from behind a tree at any moment. But when we reached the spot where we'd seen the creature, there was nothing there. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign at all that anything unusual had passed this way. Dad searched the area thoroughly, his rifle at the ready, but found nothing. "I believe you boys saw something," he said finally, his voice low and serious. "But whatever it was, it's gone now. Let's get back to the truck and head home. We can finish up here another day." The drive home was tense and quiet. Tom and I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see a giant, lumbering form emerge from the darkness at the side of the road. Dad tried to reassure us, saying it was probably just a bear, or maybe our eyes playing tricks on us in the twilight. But I could tell from the way he gripped the steering wheel and the frequent glances in his rearview mirror that he was unsettled too. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that silhouette, impossibly tall, unnaturally still, undeniably real. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Could it really have been a Bigfoot? If not, What else could explain what Tom and I had both witnessed? In the days and weeks that followed, we went back to that spot several times with Dad. We never saw the creature again, never found any concrete evidence of its existence. But something had changed in those woods for me. Every shadow held the potential for mystery, every unexplained sound a possible sign of something beyond our understanding. Years have passed since that day in McIntosh County, but the memory remains as vivid as ever. Tom and I don't talk about it much anymore. It's hard to put into words, and most people just don't believe us anyway. But sometimes, when we're together and the conversation lulls, I'll catch his eye, and I know he's thinking about it too. About that moment when the world as we knew it shifted, and we came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, but undeniably did. I've heard other stories since then, from hunters and hikers who've had their own strange encounters in those woods. Some of them sound a lot like what we saw that day. It makes me wonder, how many other people have seen something they can't explain, something that challenges everything they thought they knew about the world? I don't know if I'll ever see that creature again, or if I even want to. But I do know that the experience changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things out there beyond our current understanding, mysteries still waiting to be unraveled. And every time I find myself in the woods, especially as the day fades into twilight, I can't help but scan the trees, half expecting to see that unmistakable silhouette once more. Some nights, I still dream about it. In my dreams, the creature moves, stepping out onto the road with impossible grace for something so large. Sometimes it speaks, though I can never remember the words when I wake up. Other times, it simply stands there, watching, waiting. I always wake from these dreams with a mixture of fear and fascination, my heart racing as I try to hold on to the fading images. I've never been able to fully explain what happened that day in McIntosh County. Logic tells me it must have been some kind of mistake, a trick of the light, or an overactive imagination. But deep down, I know what I saw. Tom knows too. And somewhere out there, in the dense forests of Oklahoma, I believe that creature is still roaming, still hiding, still challenging our understanding of what's possible in this world. So if you ever find yourself in those woods, especially as the day is waning, keep your eyes open and your wits about you. You never know what you might see in that moment between light and shadow, between the known and the unknown. And if you do see something tall, something covered in hair, something that shouldn't be there but undeniably is, remember my story. Remember that you're not alone in your experience, and that sometimes the world is stranger and more wonderful than we can imagine. Story 10. It started out routine enough. We got a call about some kind of disturbance in the wooded area near the base perimeter. Probably just some rowdy soldiers blowing off steam, I figured. I grabbed my gear and headed out with my K9 partner, Rex. The air was thick and heavy as we made our way into the tree line, flashlights sweeping back and forth across the underbrush. At first, all seemed quiet. Too quiet, actually. I remember thinking how odd it was that we couldn't hear any of the usual nighttime forest sounds. No crickets chirping or owls hooting. It was like the whole woods was holding its breath. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Rex's ears perked up, and he let out a short, sharp bark. I shushed him, straining my ears to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It came again, louder this time, and closer. My hand instinctively went to my sidearm. "This is the military police," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Identify yourself." The only response was another growl, so deep I could almost feel it vibrating in my chest. Rex was getting agitated now, pulling at his leash and whining. I unholstered my pistol, adrenaline coursing through me. That's when I saw movement at the edge of the clearing about 50 yards ahead. Something big was emerging from the tree line. At first, I thought it must be a bear, but as it came into view, I realized this was something else entirely. It walked on two legs, but it was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark matted fur, broad shoulders, long arms, and the smell, dear God, the smell, like wet dog and rotting meat. I stood there, frozen, my brain unable to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be someone in a costume, right? But deep down, I knew this was no costume. This was something other. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing and slowly turned its head towards me. Our eyes met, and in that moment, time seemed to stand still. Its eyes were dark and intelligent, almost human-like, but there was something ancient and primal in that gaze that chilled me to my very soul. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Rex was going absolutely berserk, barking and snarling, but the creature paid him no mind. It just kept looking right at me. Finally, some primal instinct for self-preservation kicked in. I raised my pistol with shaking hands and fired off 2 quick rounds. The gunshots were deafening in the quiet forest. The creature didn't even flinch. It just kept staring for a few more seconds, then slowly turned and lumbered back into the tree line. I watched as it disappeared into the darkness, my mind reeling. When I could finally move again, I got on the radio and called for backup, my voice barely above a whisper. I knew how insane this would sound, but I had to report what I'd seen. The next few hours were a blur. Other MPs arrived and we searched the area, but found no sign of the creature. No footprints, no hair samples, nothing. If it weren't for the lingering smell and the fact that my spent shell casings were on the ground, I might have thought I'd imagined the whole thing. I gave my report to my commanding officer, fully expecting to be laughed out of his office or sent for a psych eval. But to my surprise, he just listened quietly, a grim look on his face. When I finished, he simply said, "You're not the first to see something like that out there, son. But we don't talk about it. Understood?" I nodded, still in shock. As I turned to leave, he added, "And Sergeant, you'd do well to forget this ever happened." But how could I forget? That encounter changed me forever. For weeks afterward, I had terrible nightmares. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, that creature's eyes still boring into me. I started jumping at shadows, always feeling like I was being watched when I was on patrol. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just a bear or some other known animal that my mind had twisted into something more sinister. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I saw that night was something science can't explain, something that shouldn't exist, but does. Over the years, I've done a lot of research, read accounts from other people who've had similar encounters. Some call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. But those names seem almost quaint compared to the primal terror I felt that night. I've never told anyone else about this. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, and I know that there are things out there in the dark woods that defy explanation. Things that remind us that for all our technology and civilization, we're not as far removed from our primitive ancestors as we'd like to think. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still feel those eyes on me, and I wonder, was I the one doing the observing that night, or was I the one being observed? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the woods the same way again, and neither would you if you'd seen what I saw. There are monsters in this world, folks. Real flesh and blood monsters. And they're closer than you think. I don't know why that creature didn't attack me that night. Maybe it was just curious. Maybe it didn't see me as a threat. Or maybe it was studying me, learning about us. Whatever the reason, I'm grateful to have survived the encounter. But a part of me wonders if someday, somewhere, someone else won't be so lucky. So if you're ever out in the woods at night and you hear something that doesn't sound quite right, don't investigate. Don't try to be a hero. Just get out of there as fast as you can. Because there are things out there in the dark things that we're not meant to understand. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. They'll haunt you for the rest of your days, just like that creature has haunted me for all these years. I'm an old man now, and I know my time is growing short. That's why I'm finally sharing this story. Someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to be prepared. Because I have a feeling that someday, somehow, that creature, or others like it, will make themselves known to the world at large. And when that day comes, God help us all. So the next time you're out in the wilderness and you feel like something's watching you, trust that instinct, because you never know what might be lurking just beyond the tree line, waiting for its moment to step into the light. And once you've looked into those eyes, well, you'll never be the same again. Take it from someone who knows all too well. Story 11. I was just 16 that summer of '84, living with my family in Stevens County, Washington. It was a typical July afternoon, hot and dry, the kind of day made for barbecues and hanging out in the backyard. That's exactly what we were doing. My parents, grandparents, and a couple aunts and uncles had all gathered for a big family cookout. The adults were clustered around the grill, beers in hand, while us kids played horseshoes and chased each other through the sprinkler. It was the epitome of small-town summer, surrounded by towering pines and rolling hills. Our property backed up to a thick stretch of forest, and beyond that was miles and miles of wilderness. I remember the smell of burgers on the grill, the sound of country music drifting from the radio, the feeling of grass between my toes. It was idyllic, peaceful, until it wasn't. I had wandered away from the others, towards the edge of our yard where it met the tree line. Something caught my eye, movement in the shadows beneath the pines. At first I thought it was a deer, or maybe a bear. We'd seen plenty of both around, but as I squinted into the gloom, trying to make out the shape, I realized this was much, much bigger than any deer. And it wasn't lumbering on four legs like a bear. No, this thing was upright, walking on two legs, striding with an unnervingly human gait. My breath caught in my throat as it emerged from the tree line. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, and covered head to toe in dark, matted fur. The sun caught its eyes for just a moment, intelligent, observant eyes set in a face that was unmistakably ape-like, yet not quite. It moved with surprising grace for its size, stepping over our property line fence like it was nothing more than a fallen log. I stood frozen, unable to move or breathe or think. Part of me wanted to run screaming back to my family, but a larger part was transfixed, watching in stunned silence as this impossible creature strode across our lawn. It seemed to move with purpose, heading diagonally across the yard towards the far corner. Did it know I was there? Could it sense me watching? I'll never forget the moment it turned its head and looked directly at me. Those eyes. There was an awareness there, an intelligence that chilled me to my core. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, vanishing into the trees on the other side of our property. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than 30 seconds, but in that half-minute, my entire worldview had been shattered. I stumbled back towards the gathering, legs shaky, mind reeling. My mom noticed me first, must have seen something in my face because she immediately asked what was wrong. I blurted out what I'd seen, the words tumbling out in a confused jumble. At first, there were nervous chuckles, like they thought I was telling some kind of joke. But as I kept insisting, describing details in a voice edged with panic, the laughter faded. My dad and grandfather exchanged a look, then set down their beers and headed towards where I was pointing. I followed behind as they strode across the lawn, my heart still racing. When we reached the fence line, my grandfather held up a hand, motioning for us to stop. He crouched down, examining the tall grass. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. There in the grass were clear indentations, massive footprints, far larger than any human foot. My dad leaned in for a closer look, then suddenly recoiled, his nose wrinkling. "You smell that?" he asked. I inhaled deeply and nearly gagged. There was a pungent, musky odor hanging in the air, like wet dog mixed with something else, something wild and foreign. We followed the prints and the smell to where I'd seen the creature disappear into the trees. There, caught on a low-hanging branch, was a tuft of coarse, dark hair. My grandfather reached out to touch it, then thought better of it, pulling his hand back. "What do you think, Dad?" my father asked, his voice hushed. My grandfather was silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he sighed, shaking his head. "I think we ought to head back to the others. No sense in worrying your mother and the rest." As we walked back, my grandfather put a hand on my shoulder. "Listen, son, I believe you saw something, but we gotta be smart about this. You start telling people about giant hairy monsters in the woods, they're liable to think you've gone off the deep end. For now, this stays between us, all right?" I nodded, still in a daze. By the time we rejoined the party, the adults had wordlessly agreed to act like nothing had happened. There were a few significant looks exchanged, a few whispered conversations. But to all outward appearances, it was back to being a normal summer afternoon. But for me, nothing would ever be truly normal again. That night, lying in bed, I kept replaying the encounter in my mind. Those eyes, that impossible stride, the sheer wrongness of seeing something so large moving with such eerie grace. Sleep was elusive, and when it finally came, my dreams were filled with dark shapes moving through moonlit forests. I'd jolt awake, heart pounding, convinced I'd heard heavy footsteps outside my window. But each time I looked, there was nothing there but shadows and silence. In the days that followed, I found myself jumping at every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush. I begged my parents to let me set up a camera facing the woods, but they shut that idea down quickly. "Best to let sleeping dogs lie," my dad said with finality. I scoured the local library for any information I could find, checked out every book on cryptozoology and Pacific Northwest folklore, but nothing I read quite matched what I'd seen. The descriptions were close, but they all felt sanitized somehow, like they were missing the raw, primal energy I'd felt emanating from that creature. As the summer wore on, I found myself spending less and less time in the backyard. The woods that had once been a playground now felt oppressive, full of watchful eyes and lurking dangers. I'd catch myself staring into the tree line, searching for any hint of movement. My parents tried to distract me, to coax me back into normal teenage life. But how could anything feel normal after what I'd seen? How could I care about school dances and football games when I knew there were monsters in the world? I became obsessed with trying to capture proof. I'd sneak out at night with my dad's old camera, hoping to catch a glimpse of that hulking shape. But all I ever got were blurry photos of shadows and an increasing sense of frustration. It was my grandfather who finally sat me down for a heart-to-heart. "Look," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I know what you saw was real. I believe you. But you can't let this consume you. There are some mysteries in this world that aren't meant to be solved. Some things we're not meant to understand." I wanted to argue, to insist that we had a responsibility to prove what was out there. But looking into my grandfather's eyes, I saw a wisdom there that gave me pause. He'd lived in these parts his whole life. If anyone understood the delicate balance between the known and unknown, it was him. Slowly, reluctantly, I began to let go of my obsession. I stopped prowling the woods at night, stopped poring over blurry photographs looking for proof. Life gradually returned to something resembling normal. But I never forgot. How could I? That encounter changed me fundamentally, altered the way I see the world. To this day, I can't look at a forest without wondering what secrets it might hold. Can't hear an unexplained sound in the night without feeling that old familiar surge of adrenaline. I've never seen anything like it again, never found any concrete proof. But I know what I saw that day. And I know that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, there are things that defy explanation. Things that remind us that the world is bigger and stranger than we can imagine. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the pines, I find myself drawn to the edge of the woods, and for just a moment I'll let myself wonder, is it out there still, watching, waiting? The thought sends a shiver down my spine, a mixture of fear and exhilaration that takes me right back to that summer day in 1984. I've never told this story publicly before. For years I kept it locked away, a secret shared only with those who were there that day. But as time passes, I feel an increasing need to share my experience, not to convince anyone or prove anything, but simply to add my voice to the chorus of those who have glimpsed something beyond the ordinary, because I know now that I'm not alone. There are others out there who have seen things they can't explain, who have brushed up against the unknown. And maybe, just maybe, by sharing our stories, we can start to make sense of the mysteries that surround us. So that's my story. Take from it what you will. But know this, the next time you're in the woods and the hair on the back of your neck stands up when you feel those unseen eyes upon you, trust your instincts, because sometimes the monsters in the shadows are all too real. Story 12. I'll never forget that school trip to Hoko, Washington in July 1984. It was supposed to be a fun 12-day adventure in nature, but it turned into something that still haunts me to this day. I was 15 years old at the time, excited to spend nearly 2 weeks camping and hiking with my classmates. Little did I know that we were about to encounter something that would change our lives forever. It was the 3rd day of our trip. We had spent the morning hiking through dense forest, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. By early afternoon, we reached a small clearing near a bubbling creek. Our teachers, Mr. Johnson and Ms. Davis, decided it was a good spot for a lunch break. We were all grateful for the rest, sprawling out on the rocky shore and dipping our tired feet in the cool water. I was sitting with my friends, Jenny and Mike, when I first noticed something strange. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement across the creek, maybe 50 yards away. At first, I thought it was just another student, but as I turned to look directly at it, I felt my blood run cold. There, partially obscured by the undergrowth, was a large, hairy figure. It was crouched down by the water's edge, its long arms reaching towards the creek. The creature's body was covered in dark, matted fur, and even from this distance I could tell it was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall if it stood upright. I nudged Jenny and whispered, "Do you see that?" She followed my gaze and let out a small gasp. By now, Mike had noticed too, and soon a hushed murmur spread through our group as more students became aware of the creature's presence. Mr. Johnson must have heard the commotion because he came over to see what was going on. As soon as he spotted the creature, his face went pale. He tried to quiet us down, but it was too late. The creature had noticed us. In a movement that seemed impossibly fluid for its size, the thing stood up to its full height. It turned its head towards us, and I swear I could feel its gaze boring into me. Its face was a mix of human and ape-like features, with deep-set eyes that looked unnervingly intelligent. For a moment that felt like an eternity, it just stood there, staring at us. Then, without warning, it turned and loped back into the forest. Its gait was strange, a mix of bipedal walking and using its long arms to propel itself forward. In seconds, it had disappeared into the thick underbrush, leaving us all in a state of shocked silence. Ms. Davis was the first to break the tension. She clapped her hands loudly, trying to get our attention. "All right, everyone, let's pack up. We need to move on to our next campsite." As we hurriedly gathered our things, I overheard Mr. Johnson and Ms. Davis talking in hushed tones. "We can't let this get out of hand," Mr. Johnson was saying. "You know how kids can be with their imaginations." Ms. Davis nodded, then raised her voice to address the group. "Listen up, everyone. What we just saw was probably just a man camping in the woods. Maybe he was bathing in the creek and got startled by us. There's no need to let our imaginations run wild." But we knew better. What we had seen was no man. Its proportions were all wrong, its movements too fluid and powerful for any human. And that face, I knew I'd never forget those eyes. As we hiked to our next campsite, an eerie silence fell over our usually chatty group. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts, trying to process what we had just witnessed. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the bushes, every snapping twig made me jump. That night, as we sat around the campfire, nobody wanted to talk about what had happened. Our teachers kept trying to steer the conversation towards normal topics, but their forced cheerfulness only made things more uncomfortable. I noticed Mr. Johnson taking frequent glances into the darkness beyond our camp, his hand never far from the flashlight at his belt. As we settled into our tents for the night, I heard Jenny whisper from her sleeping bag, "Do you think it's still out there?" I didn't answer. I couldn't bring myself to voice the fear that was gnawing at my insides. Sleep was nearly impossible that night. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified, and my imagination ran wild with visions of that creature lurking just beyond the thin fabric of our tent. At one point, I could have sworn I heard heavy footsteps circling our campsite, but I was too terrified to look outside. The next morning, we woke to find large, strange footprints in the soft earth around our campsite. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, much larger than a human foot, with a shape that was almost ape-like. Mr. Johnson quickly ushered us away from the area, insisting we needed to cover more ground that day. As we hiked, the feeling of being watched intensified. Several times throughout the day, we heard the sound of rocks tumbling down nearby slopes, yet we never saw what caused it. At one point, there was a loud crash in the underbrush not far from the trail, causing several students to scream. Mr. Johnson and Ms. Davis tried to play it off as wildlife, but the fear in their eyes betrayed their words. That evening, as we set up camp, I overheard Mr. Johnson on the satellite phone speaking in hushed tones. "I don't care what protocol says," he was saying, his voice strained. "We need to get these kids out of here. Something's not right." But whatever response he got seemed to frustrate him further. As he hung up, I heard him mutter, "Bureaucratic idiots." The next few days passed in a haze of tension and fear. We continued our planned route, but gone was the carefree atmosphere of the early days of our trip. We hiked in tight groups, no one wanting to stray too far from the others. At night, we'd huddle close to the campfire, jumping at every sound from the forest. The strange occurrences continued, more unexplained footprints, the constant feeling of eyes on us. Once, I woke in the middle of the night to hear what sounded like deep, rumbling breathing just outside our tent. I was too paralyzed with fear to wake the others or look outside. On the 10th day of our trip, things came to a head. We were hiking along a narrow ridge when we heard a loud, inhuman howl echo through the valley below. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before, part roar, part scream, and entirely terrifying. Several students burst into tears, and even Mr. Johnson looked shaken. That was the breaking point. Mr. Johnson announced that we would be cutting our trip short and heading back to civilization the next day. Nobody protested. We were all more than ready to leave this nightmare behind. The final night in the wilderness was the longest of my life. Nobody slept. We sat in a tight circle around the campfire, our teachers taking turns to keep watch. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us on edge. I don't think I've ever been so grateful to see the sun rise. The hike back to our pickup point was a blur. We moved quickly, driven by the desperate need to escape the forest and its terrifying inhabitant. When we finally reached the clearing where our bus was waiting, there were tears of relief. As we boarded the bus, I took one last look at the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw movement among the trees, a flash of dark fur, a glimpse of those haunting eyes. But then it was gone, and I was left wondering if it had ever really been there at all. The ride home was subdued. Our teachers made us promise not to talk about what had happened, insisting again that it was all just a misunderstanding, a man camping in the woods. But we knew the truth. We had seen something that defied explanation, something that shouldn't exist. It's been years since that trip, but I still have nightmares about those eyes staring at me from the forest. I've never gone camping again, and the sound of rustling leaves still makes my heart race. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet of night, I swear I can hear that bone-chilling howl echoing in the distance. I don't know what we encountered in those woods, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or something else entirely. I can't say for sure. But I know what I saw, what we all saw. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget the terror of those 12 days in Hoko, Washington, when we came face to face with something straight out of our worst nightmares. Story 13. I had the windows down, enjoying the breeze and the smell of the pine trees. The radio was playing softly, some classic rock station. It was a beautiful, clear night, and I was feeling relaxed after a fun evening with friends. As I rounded a bend, my headlights swept across something that made my blood run cold. There, on the side of the road, was the largest, most terrifying creature I've ever seen in my life. At first I thought it must be a bear, but as I got closer, I realized this was no bear. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, and it was standing upright on 2 legs. The thing was covered in shiny black fur from head to toe, but the fur wasn't shaggy like a bear's. It was sleeker, almost glossy looking in my headlights. As I got closer, more details came into focus, and I felt my heart start racing. The proportions were all wrong for any animal I'd ever seen. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging down almost to its knees. The body was powerfully built, with broad shoulders and a barrel chest. But the face, God, the face is what still haunts my nightmares to this day. It was disturbingly human-like, but twisted into an expression of pure rage. The brow was heavy and protruding, shadowing deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with an eerie intelligence. I slowed the car, unable to look away from this horrifying sight. The creature turned and looked right at me. In that moment, I've never felt smaller or more vulnerable in my entire life. It bared its teeth, huge yellowed fangs that looked capable of ripping me to shreds. A low growl rumbled from its chest, so deep I could feel it vibrating in my bones. I was frozen in terror, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My foot hovered over the brake, torn between stopping to get a better look and flooring it to get the hell out of there. Before I could decide, the creature moved. In 2 massive strides, it reached the guardrail on the side of the road. I expected it to smash through the metal barrier, but to my utter shock, it smoothly vaulted over the rail in one fluid motion. Its movements were unnaturally graceful for something so huge. The legs never fully straightened as it ran, giving it a loping gait unlike anything I'd seen before. As it cleared the guardrail, I noticed something else that made my skin crawl. It had visible male genitalia swinging between its legs. This was no costume or hoax. This was a living, breathing male creature of some kind. The thing disappeared down the steep cliff on the other side of the guardrail. I sat there for a moment in stunned silence, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Part of me wanted to pull over and investigate further. but a much bigger part was screaming at me to get out of there as fast as possible. I listened to that voice and stepped on the gas. As I sped away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I swear I saw a dark shape move at the top of the cliff. But then it was gone. I drove home in a daze, hands shaking on the wheel. I kept expecting to see the creature burst out of the woods at any moment, but the rest of the drive was uneventful. When I got home, I sat in my driveway for a long time, unable to bring myself to get out of the car. The house suddenly felt very far away and exposed. What if that thing had followed me somehow? I eventually worked up the courage to make a dash for the front door. I locked it behind me and did a thorough check of every room, closet, and crawl space. Logically, I knew there was no way it could have gotten inside, but I had to be sure. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every little noise had me on edge, a branch scraping the window, the house settling, the wind whistling through a crack. I kept replaying the encounter over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of it. The next morning, exhausted and strung out, I seriously considered whether I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I dozed off at the wheel for a few seconds and had some kind of waking nightmare. But it had felt so viscerally real. I could still picture every detail of the creature with perfect clarity. The ripple of muscles under its fur as it moved, the yellowish tint to its eyes, the steam of its breath in the cool night air. I spent the next few days in a fog, unable to focus on anything. I kept it to myself, afraid people would think I was crazy if I said anything. But it was eating me up inside. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I confided in a close friend, half expecting him to laugh it off. To my surprise, he listened intently and seemed to take me seriously. He told me there had been other sightings of similar creatures in the Pacific Northwest over the years. Some people called it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Hearing that I wasn't alone in this experience was both reassuring and terrifying. My friend encouraged me to report the sighting to a Bigfoot research organization. I was hesitant at first, still doubting my own sanity. But eventually, I worked up the nerve to submit an anonymous report online. To my shock, they responded almost immediately. They had questions about specific details, the exact location, the creature's gait, any sounds it made. The fact that they were so interested and seemed to find my account credible shook me to my core. What if this thing was real? In the weeks that followed, I found myself going down a rabbit hole of Bigfoot research. I read countless eyewitness accounts, looked at alleged footprint casts, and watched grainy video footage. Some of it seemed far-fetched, but other accounts lined up eerily well with what I had seen. The descriptions of the creature's appearance and movement were often strikingly similar to my experience. I became obsessed, spending hours every night reading and researching. I started having vivid nightmares about the encounter. In my dreams, the creature would chase me through endless dark forests, always just a step behind. I grew paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder when I was outside. Every shadow in the woods seemed to hide a lurking monster. I avoided driving on rural roads at night, especially anywhere near where I'd had my sighting. This went on for months. My work started to suffer as I grew more and more sleep-deprived and anxious. Friends and family noticed something was off, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. Finally, nearly a year after the incident, I reached a breaking point. I realized I couldn't go on living in fear like this. I had to face what happened head-on. I drove out to the spot where I'd seen the creature that night. It was broad daylight this time, but my palms were still sweating as I pulled over to the side of the road. I got out of the car on shaky legs and walked over to the guardrail. Looking down the steep cliff on the other side, I was amazed again at how easily that thing had navigated the treacherous terrain. Standing there in the quiet forest, I tried to make peace with what I'd seen. Whether it was real or some kind of hallucination, I knew I couldn't let it control my life anymore. As I turned to leave, movement in the trees caught my eye. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw a flash of dark fur and a pair of gleaming eyes watching me. But when I looked closer, there was nothing there. I got back in my car and drove home, feeling lighter somehow. I can't explain what I saw that night in July 1984, but I've come to accept that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm driving on a lonely road late at night. But the paralyzing fear is gone. Now there's just a sense of awe at the mysteries that might be lurking out there in the dark. Story 14. The radio was playing softly, some mellow late-night tunes to keep me company. I remember it was a warm night, but I had my windows rolled up tight. Something about driving alone in the dark always made me feel a little uneasy. As I approached the bridge over the Wishkah River, I noticed some movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just shadows from the trees, but then I saw it. A massive, dark figure standing near the riverbank. My heart started pounding as I slowed the car, trying to get a better look. The headlights illuminated the area, and I could clearly see that this was no ordinary animal or person. It was enormous, easily over 7 feet tall, and covered in dark, matted fur. The creature was standing upright on 2 legs, its arms hanging at its sides. Even from a distance I could tell how muscular and powerful it looked. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, tapering down to a narrower waist. I was frozen in shock, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to floor it and speed away, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the sight. The being slowly turned its head towards my car. I caught a glimpse of its face, a broad, flat nose, deep-set eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. It wasn't aggressive or threatening, just observant, like it was as curious about me as I was about it. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. I kept waiting for it to run away or charge at the car, but it simply stood there, watching. I had the surreal thought that maybe I had fallen asleep at the wheel, and this was all a dream. But the chill running down my spine and the sweat beading on my forehead told me this was all too real. Finally, I managed to shake myself out of my daze. With trembling hands, I put the car back in drive and slowly started moving forward. The creature's gaze followed me as I crossed the bridge, but it made no move to approach. As soon as I was across, I slammed on the gas and sped away as fast as I could. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. It couldn't have been a bear, the proportions were all wrong, and it was standing fully upright. And there was no way it was a person in a costume. The movements were too fluid, too natural. When I got home, I was in such a state that I could barely get my key in the door. I stumbled inside and collapsed on the couch, my whole body shaking. Sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hulking figure by the river. The next morning, I seriously questioned whether I had imagined the whole thing, but the vivid memory of those eyes staring into mine, I knew deep down it had been real. I spent hours scouring the local newspaper and asking around town if anyone else had seen anything strange, but came up empty. For weeks afterwards, I avoided driving anywhere near that spot after dark. Even now, years later, I get goosebumps thinking about it. I've read about Bigfoot sightings since then, and while I used to scoff at those stories, now I'm not so sure. Whatever I saw that night in Aberdeen was unlike anything I've encountered before or since. Sometimes I wish I could go back and get a better look, maybe even try to communicate with it somehow. But mostly, I'm just grateful I made it home safely that night. I've never told many people about this experience. I know how crazy it sounds. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget that moment of connection with something that defies explanation. It's made me look at the world differently and wonder what other mysteries might be out there, hiding just out of sight. That night changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I find myself paying closer attention to the shadows when I'm out in nature, always half expecting to catch a glimpse of that towering figure again. I've become fascinated with cryptozoology and reports of similar sightings. Part of me hopes I'll never have another encounter like that. It was terrifying in a primal way I can't fully describe. But another part of me longs to know more, to understand what exactly I witnessed that night. I've driven past that spot on the river countless times since then, always in daylight, always scanning the tree line. I've never seen any sign of the creature again. Sometimes I wonder if it was a one-in-a-million chance encounter, a brief crossing of paths between our world and something beyond our understanding. The few times I've tried to talk about it with others, I've been met with skepticism or outright disbelief. I can't blame them. If someone had told me this story before that night, I probably would have thought they were making it up or had been drinking. But I know what I saw. The image is burned into my memory. The massive silhouette, the matted fur, those eyes that seemed to hold an ancient wisdom. It wasn't just a random animal or a trick of the light. There was an intelligence there, a presence that felt almost sacred. I've spent years trying to rationalize it, to find some logical explanation. But in my heart, I know I encountered something that science can't yet explain. It's humbling to realize how little we truly know about the world around us. That night in Aberdeen opened my eyes to possibilities I'd never considered before. It made me question everything I thought I knew about nature and reality itself. In a way, it was almost a spiritual experience, a reminder that there are forces and beings in this world far beyond our comprehension. I still drive past that spot sometimes, usually during the day, but occasionally, when I'm feeling particularly brave or foolish, I'll take a late-night drive down that road. I never see anything out of the ordinary, but there's always a part of me that hopes for another glimpse of the impossible. I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with what happened that night, but I do know that it changed me forever. It taught me to keep an open mind, to question what I think I know, and to remember that there's always more to discover in this weird and wonderful world of ours. So that's my story. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I needed to share it. Maybe someone out there has had a similar experience, or maybe putting it out into the world will help me finally process it after all these years. All I know is that on a warm July night in 1984, I saw something that defied explanation, and I'll never be the same. Story 15. It was August 1984, and I had driven out to King County for a weekend getaway. I'd been feeling stressed at work and thought some time in nature would do me good. If only I'd known what was waiting for me out there in those dark woods. I arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon and set up my tent near the shore of the lake. It was a beautiful spot, surrounded by towering pines and rugged mountains. As the sun started to set, I built a small fire and roasted some hot dogs for dinner. Max lounged contentedly nearby, occasionally perking his ears up at the sounds of birds and small animals in the underbrush. Everything seemed so peaceful. I remember thinking how glad I was that I'd decided to come out here, away from the noise and stress of the city. Little did I know that in just a few short hours, I'd be wishing I was anywhere else. As night fell, I doused the fire and crawled into my sleeping bag, with Max curled up at my feet. The air was cool and crisp, and I could hear the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. I drifted off to sleep, feeling calm and content. I'm not sure exactly what time it was when I was jolted awake by the most blood-curdling sound I've ever heard in my life. It was around 10 p.m., I think. This scream ripped through the quiet night air. I shot up, my heart pounding. Max was on his feet in an instant, hackles raised and growling low in his throat. The scream was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It started as this high-pitched shriek that made my skin crawl, then dropped to a deep, guttural roar. And it went on and on for what felt like minutes. I was paralyzed with fear, straining my ears and trying to figure out what could possibly make a sound like that. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost worse. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I'd just heard. A bear, maybe. But I knew bears didn't sound like that. Mountain lion? Again, not even close to what this was. I fumbled for my flashlight with shaking hands and unzipped the tent, peering out into the darkness. The beam of light seemed so feeble against the pitch black of the forest. I couldn't see anything moving out there, but I had the overwhelming sense that something was watching me. Max was still on high alert, his eyes fixed on the tree line and a low growl rumbling in his chest. That's when I heard twigs snapping, like something large was moving through the woods nearby. My blood ran cold. I was debating whether to make a run for my car when I heard voices coming from a nearby campsite. Thank God, I thought, I'm not alone out here. I quickly zipped up my tent and grabbed Max's collar, not wanting to venture out in case whatever made that sound was still close by. I could hear a man and woman talking in hushed, frightened tones. They must have heard it too. Their voices got louder as they approached my tent. "Hello?" a woman called out tentatively. "Are you awake in there?" Yes, I managed to croak out. "Did you hear that sound?" "We sure did," the man replied. "What the hell was that? I've never heard anything like it in my life." I unzipped the tent and poked my head out. The couple was standing there, both looking as terrified as I felt. They introduced themselves as Tom and Lisa. They had driven up from Seattle for the weekend, just like me. "We were just about to go to sleep when we heard it," Lisa said, hugging herself tightly. "It sounded so close, like it was right outside our tent." Tom nodded grimly. "And then we heard something big moving around out there. Breaking branches, heavy footsteps. Whatever it is, it's no normal animal." We stood there whispering for a while, all of us jumping at every little sound from the forest. None of us wanted to say what we were all thinking, that this sounded an awful lot like the stories you hear about Bigfoot. I've never really believed in that stuff, always thought it was just tall tales and overactive imaginations. But in that moment, deep in the dark woods, with that inhuman scream still echoing in my ears, I wasn't so sure anymore. We decided to stay up for the rest of the night. None of us felt safe trying to sleep, and we figured there was safety in numbers. We gathered in Tom and Lisa's slightly larger tent, huddled around a battery-powered lantern. Max curled up protectively at my feet, still on edge. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves had us all tensing up. A couple times we heard heavy footsteps circling the campsite. It was like whatever was out there was watching us, waiting. I've never felt fear like that before, the paralyzing terror of knowing something is out there but not being able to see it or understand what it is. We talked in hushed voices to distract ourselves, sharing stories from our lives back in the city that seemed so far away now. But our eyes kept darting to the walls of the tent, straining to see if we could make out any shapes moving in the darkness beyond. At one point, maybe around 2 or 3 a.m., we heard that bone-chilling scream again. It was further away this time, echoing from somewhere deeper in the forest. But it was unmistakably the same sound. Max started barking frantically, and I had to hold him tight to keep him from bolting out of the tent. When dawn finally broke, it felt like we'd aged years in a single night. We emerged from the tent, blinking in the pale morning light. The forest looked so normal and peaceful. It was hard to believe the terror we'd experienced just hours before. We searched the area around our campsites but didn't find much. Just some broken branches, and what might have been large footprints in a muddy patch of ground. Nothing conclusive, nothing we could point to as definitive proof of what we'd encountered. Tom and Lisa packed up quickly and left, both looking shell-shocked. I couldn't blame them. I was right behind them, throwing my gear haphazardly into my car with shaking hands. Max seemed eager to leave too, whining softly and staying close to my side. As I drove home, my mind kept replaying the events of the night. That scream, those footsteps, the palpable sense of being watched by something in the darkness. I've been on dozens of camping trips before and since, but I've never experienced anything like that night at Alpine Lake. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was some kind of unusual animal, or a combination of sounds that just seemed terrifying in the dark. But deep down, I know it was something else. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. I've never gone back to Alpine Lake. I still enjoy camping and hiking, but I stick to more populated areas now. And I always bring a friend. Never again will I camp alone in the deep woods. Sometimes on dark nights, when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my window, I'll hear a sound that reminds me of that scream. And for a moment, I'm right back there in that tent, heart pounding, wondering what's lurking just beyond the circle of my flashlight beam. I don't know if it was Bigfoot or something else entirely, but I know that something is out there in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. Something that defies explanation, something ancient and powerful, and I hope I never encounter it again. Story 16. I'll never forget that day in August 1984. My buddy Tom and I had decided to hike the Franklin Falls Trail in King County, Washington. We were both avid hikers and had explored many of the trails in the area, but this one was new to us. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot, with a gentle breeze rustling through the trees. We set out early in the morning, excited for a day of adventure in the beautiful Pacific Northwest wilderness. The first part of the hike was uneventful. We chatted as we walked, catching up on each other's lives and pointing out interesting plants or rock formations along the trail. The forest was lush and green, with towering evergreens creating a canopy overhead. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the views became more and more spectacular. We could see for miles across the rugged landscape. About 2 hours into our hike, we stopped for a quick snack break. That's when we first heard it. A loud, piercing scream echoing through the mountains. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite human, but not like any animal I was familiar with either. Tom and I looked at each other, startled. "What the hell was that?" I asked. Tom shook his head, looking uneasy. "I have no idea. Maybe some kind of bird." We listened intently, but didn't hear anything else for several minutes. Just as we were about to continue on, another scream rang out. This one was closer, and even more bone-chilling than the first. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "Okay, that's definitely not a bird," Tom said, his voice tense. I nodded in agreement, scanning the forest around us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The peaceful atmosphere from earlier had evaporated, replaced by an oppressive sense of dread. We debated whether to continue on or turn back. Part of me was curious to investigate the source of the sounds, but a much bigger part wanted to get the hell out of there. In the end, our instinct for self-preservation won out. We quickly packed up our gear and started heading back down the trail. As we walked, the screams continued intermittently. Sometimes they seemed to be coming from behind us, other times from somewhere off to the sides. It was impossible to pinpoint the exact location. They would fade away for a while, lulling us into a false sense of security, then suddenly pierce the air again, closer than ever. I've never felt fear like I did during that hike back to the car. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made us jump. We tried to move as quickly and quietly as possible, not wanting to draw attention to ourselves, but it felt like whatever was out there knew exactly where we were. At one point, we heard heavy footsteps crashing through the forest parallel to the trail. They were moving fast, too fast for a human. Tom and I exchanged terrified glances and picked up our pace, practically jogging now. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see some monstrous creature emerging from the trees. But there was never anything visible, just those horrible screams and the sense of a malevolent presence stalking us. As we neared the trailhead, the screams finally began to fade. But the relief I felt was short-lived. Just as the parking area came into view, we heard one final scream, the loudest and closest yet. It sounded like it was right behind us. We sprinted the last 100 yards to the car. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking as I tried to unlock the door. We threw ourselves inside, and I peeled out of there as fast as I could. Neither of us spoke for a long time as I sped down the mountain road. We were both trembling, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, Tom broke the silence. What do you think that was?" he asked quietly. I shook my head. "I don't know. I really don't know." In the years since, I've tried to rationalize what happened that day. I've researched local wildlife, looked into other strange encounters in the area, even considered the possibility of some elaborate hoax. But nothing quite fits. Those screams were like nothing I've ever heard before or since. And the overwhelming feeling of being hunted, I still get chills thinking about it. I've never gone back to Franklin Falls Trail. The memory of that day is seared into my mind. Sometimes I still have nightmares about those screams echoing through the mountains and wake up in a cold sweat. I know this might sound crazy to some people. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I'm not sure I'd believe it. But I swear every word is true. Something was out there in those woods, something that didn't want us there. And I thank my lucky stars we made it out when we did. I've shared this story with very few people over the years. Most just laugh it off or try to explain it away. But I know what I heard and felt that day. There are things in this world that can't be easily explained, things that defy our understanding of what's possible. I still love hiking and spending time outdoors, but that experience changed me. I'm more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings. And I never go into the wilderness without that gnawing fear in the back of my mind. What if I hear those screams again? What if this time, whatever was out there decides to reveal itself? I don't have any profound conclusions or explanations to offer. All I know is what happened to me and Tom that August day in 1984. It was real, it was terrifying, and it's haunted me ever since. If you're ever hiking in the Pacific Northwest and hear strange screams echoing through the mountains, don't stick around to investigate. Get out of there as fast as you can. You might just be saving your own life. Story 17. I was just a regular guy who loved running through the beautiful trails of Whatcom County, Washington. It was my daily ritual, a way to clear my head and stay fit. But on that crisp October day in 1984, everything changed. I still struggle to make sense of what happened, but I'll do my best to recount it. The air was cool and damp that morning as I set out on my usual route through the dense forest. Fallen leaves crunched under my feet, and the smell of pine filled my lungs. About 2 miles in, I started to get this weird feeling, like I was being watched. At first, I tried to shake it off, probably just my imagination running wild in the quiet woods. But the sensation kept growing stronger, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I slowed my pace and glanced around, trying to spot whatever was causing this unease. That's when I saw it. Just off the trail, partially hidden behind a massive Douglas fir, was something. My brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing at first. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, and covered in reddish-brown hair that blended perfectly with the tree bark. Except for the area around its eyes, that part was bare, revealing dark, intelligent eyes that were fixed right on me. I froze in my tracks, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The creature slowly emerged from behind the tree, and I realized with a jolt of shock that it wasn't alone. Clutching its leg was a smaller version, a child, I guess you'd call it. The adult, I'm assuming it was the mother, made this gentle, sweeping gesture with its massive arm, almost like it was showing the little one something. Me, probably. The whole scene was so surreal, like something out of a nature documentary, except I was right there in the middle of it. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Time seemed to stand still as we just stared at each other. I noticed a faint, musky odor in the air, kind of like wet dog but earthier. Then the mother Bigfoot, because what else could it have been, took a small step forward and leaned slightly in my direction. I can't even describe the feeling that washed over me in that moment. It was like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I was completely paralyzed. Those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. There was an intelligence there, a curiosity maybe, but also something ancient and wild that made my blood run cold. I don't know how long we stood there like that. It could have been seconds or minutes, but suddenly a branch snapped somewhere off in the forest, breaking the spell. The mother Bigfoot's head whipped around toward the sound, and in that split second, my body finally kicked into gear. I turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached my house, slamming the door behind me and collapsing on the floor, gasping for air. My legs were shaking so bad I could barely stand. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, trying to wrap my head around what had happened. Part of me wondered if I had imagined the whole thing, if maybe I was losing my mind. But I knew deep down that it was real. For weeks afterward, I couldn't bring myself to go back on that trail. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those piercing eyes staring back at me. I had trouble sleeping, constantly waking up in a cold sweat from nightmares about being chased through the woods. Eventually, I worked up the courage to return to my running route, but I was never able to shake that feeling of being watched. I started carrying a camera with me, hoping to capture proof of what I'd seen, but I never encountered the creatures again. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, hidden away in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. I've tried talking to a few people about my experience over the years, but most just laugh it off or look at me like I'm crazy. I get it. I probably wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't lived through it myself. But I know what I saw that day, and it's changed the way I look at the world forever. There are things out there in the woods that we can't explain, creatures that have managed to stay hidden from us for centuries. That encounter lasted only a few minutes, but it's burned into my memory for life. The sheer size of the adult, the gentle way it interacted with its young, the unmistakable intelligence in its eyes, it all points to something far more complex than just some undiscovered ape. I've done a lot of research since then, trying to find similar accounts or any scientific explanation for what I experienced. I've read about other Bigfoot sightings in the area, some with eerily similar details to mine. But nothing quite matches up to that intense, face-to-face encounter I had. Sometimes I find myself wondering about that mother and child. Are they still out there, roaming the forests of Whatcom County? Do they remember our encounter as vividly as I do? And how many others like them might be living right under our noses, expertly avoiding detection? I know a lot of people will read this and think I'm just another crazy Bigfoot believer or attention seeker, but I swear on everything I hold dear that this really happened. I was just an ordinary guy out for a run, and in the span of a few minutes, my entire worldview was turned upside down. I still run those trails sometimes, always with a mix of fear and hope. Fear of encountering something that defies explanation again, but also a secret hope that maybe, just maybe, I'll catch another glimpse of those incredible creatures. Every rustle in the bushes, every snapped twig makes my heart race. I'm hyper-aware of my surroundings now, always scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The encounter has left me with so many questions. How long have these creatures been living alongside us without our knowledge? Are they some kind of missing link in human evolution? And most importantly, what would happen if more people started to encounter them? Would we try to study them, protect them, or would we drive them to extinction out of fear and misunderstanding? I don't have any answers, only the vivid memory of those few intense moments on the trail. Sometimes I wish I could forget it all and go back to my normal life. But then I remember the look in that creature's eyes, so wild yet so familiar, and I know that I'll never be the same. All I can do is share my story and hope that someday we'll understand more about these mysterious beings that share our world. So if you're ever hiking or running through the forests of the Pacific Northwest, keep your eyes and ears open. You never know what might be watching you from just beyond the tree line. And if you do happen to come face to face with something unexplainable, remember, you're not alone. There are others out there who have seen what you've seen, who understand the mix of awe and terror that comes with such an encounter. All we can do is keep telling our stories and hope that someday the truth will come to light. Story 18. I was just a 12-year-old kid back in the fall of '84, living in Cowlitz County, Washington. My dad and I loved to go fishing together on the weekends, and this particular Saturday in October was perfect for it. Crisp autumn air, leaves starting to turn, that kind of thing. We packed up our gear early that morning and headed out to our favorite spot on the Columbia River. It was a quiet, secluded area surrounded by dense forest, the kind of place where you feel like you're the only people for miles around. We'd been fishing there for hours, Dad in his usual spot downstream, and me a little ways upstream, where I liked to perch on this big flat rock. I remember I was getting kind of bored and restless, as kids do. The fish weren't really biting, so I was mostly just daydreaming and watching the river flow by. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or something moving between the trees on the opposite bank. But then it came fully into view, and I felt my whole body go cold. There was this figure, standing upright on two legs, but definitely not human. It was tall and weirdly skinny with long, gangly arms, and it was covered in what looked like black fur or hair. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, but something about its proportions was just wrong, unnatural. I was frozen in place, afraid to move or even breathe. The creature hadn't seen me. It seemed totally focused on the water. Then, in one lightning-fast motion, its arm shot out and snatched a fish right out of the river. What happened next is burned into my memory. The thing raised the still wriggling fish high above its head, then brought it down hard against a nearby rock. Whack! Over and over again with these quick, precise movements. It was so methodical, almost robotic. Whack! 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 I don't know how long I sat there watching. It felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. The sound of the fish being bashed against the rock seemed to echo through the trees. I wanted to yell for my dad to run away, but I was paralyzed with fear. Finally, the creature stopped. The fish was a mangled mess at that point. It just stood there for a moment, perfectly still, holding the dead fish. Then it turned and walked back into the forest. But the way it moved, it wasn't like a normal walk. It was fluid, almost gliding, barely disturbing the underbrush. As soon as it disappeared from view, the spell broke. I scrambled off my rock and ran to my dad, tripping over myself in my panic. I was crying and babbling, trying to explain what I'd seen, but Dad just laughed it off. He said I must have dozed off and had a crazy dream. "There's nothing out here but us and the fish, kiddo," he said, ruffling my hair. "Your imagination's working overtime." But I knew what I saw. It wasn't a dream or my imagination. That thing was real. We packed up and left not long after. I begged Dad not to make me go back to that spot, and thankfully he agreed. We found new fishing spots after that day. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about that creature. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of that fish being smashed against the rock echoing in my ears. I became scared of the woods behind our house. I'd stare out my bedroom window at night, convinced I'd see those long, gangly arms reaching out from between the trees. I tried telling my friends at school, but they just laughed and called me a liar or a scaredy cat. Eventually, I stopped talking about it altogether. But I never forgot. As I got older, I started researching, trying to figure out what I might have seen that day. I came across stories of Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest, but none of them quite matched what I saw. This thing was different, taller, thinner, more alien, I guess. I've spent years trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe it was some kind of large bird. Hell, maybe Dad was right, and it was just an incredibly vivid dream. But deep down, I know none of those explanations fit. What I saw that day was something else entirely. I'm 51 years old now, and I've never seen anything like it again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I'll be out in nature, maybe camping or hiking, and I'll hear a twig snap in the distance or catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. And for just a split second, I'm that terrified 12-year-old boy again, watching a nightmare come to life on the banks of the Columbia River. I've never been able to shake the feeling that there are things out there in the wilderness that we can't explain, things that don't fit neatly into our understanding of the natural world. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough, you might catch a glimpse of them. I still fish occasionally, but never alone, and never in secluded areas. I stick to popular spots with lots of other people around, and I always keep one eye on the tree line just in case. That day changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there's more to this world than we know. And honestly, sometimes I wish I could go back to being that naive kid who thought he knew everything about the woods and rivers of Washington State. Because now I know better. Now I know that sometimes the monsters from our nightmares are real, and they're out there, waiting in the shadows, just beyond the edge of what we consider normal. I've never told this story publicly before. For years, I was too afraid of being ridiculed or dismissed. But now, I feel like it's important to share. Not to convince anyone or prove anything, but just to put it out there. Maybe someone else has seen something similar. Maybe I'm not alone in this. All I know is that on that autumn day in 1984, I saw something that defied explanation. And whether you believe me or not, it happened. That creature was real. And who knows? Maybe it's still out there, snatching fish from rivers and vanishing into the forest, leaving nothing behind but questions and a lingering sense of unease. So if you're ever out in the woods of the Pacific Northwest, keep your eyes open and your wits about you, because you never know what might be watching from just beyond the tree line. And if you hear the sound of something being repeatedly smashed against a rock, well, maybe it's best to pack up your gear and head home. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 19. I was just a young guy back in '84, fresh out of high school and eager to prove myself as a real outdoorsman. My buddy Jake and I had been planning our big hunting trip for months, saving up for gear and poring over maps of King County. We were determined to bag ourselves a nice elk and come back with enough meat to last the winter. It was a crisp October morning when we set out, breath frosting in the chilly air as we hiked deep into the woods. There was an eerie quiet, just the crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional bird call. Something felt off, but I chalked it up to opening day jitters. We'd been walking for hours, following what looked like promising elk sign, when Jake suddenly froze and grabbed my arm. About 50 yards ahead, partially obscured by some low-hanging branches, was a massive dark shape. My heart started racing. This had to be the bull elk we'd been tracking all morning. I raised my rifle, trying to get a clear shot through the foliage. But before I could line up my sights, the shape moved. And that's when everything went sideways. This thing stood up on 2 legs and kept rising and rising. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It had to be over 8 feet tall, covered in long grayish fur. For a split second I thought maybe it was a bear, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms were incredibly long and muscular, hanging down past its knees. Jake and I just stood there frozen, rifles forgotten at our sides. I could hear Jake's ragged breathing next to me as we tried to comprehend what we were looking at. The creature slowly turned its head in our direction, and I got a glimpse of its face. It was dark, almost black, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow. Not like an animal at all. There was an intelligence there that sent chills down my spine. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. I don't know if it was curiosity or a warning, but the creature made no move to flee or attack. It was studying us as intently as we were studying it. A branch snapped somewhere off to our right, and the spell was broken. The creature's head whipped towards the sound, and in that instant, I came to my senses and raised my rifle. But Jake grabbed the barrel, forcing it down. "Don't shoot!" he hissed. "We don't know what the hell that is. You could get in huge trouble." He was right, of course. Washington had laws against killing unidentified animals. If this wasn't some known species, we'd be in a world of hurt legally. Not to mention, did I really want to be responsible for killing what might be a totally new creature? The ethical implications made my head spin. While Jake and I had our whispered argument, the creature decided it had seen enough. It dropped back down on all fours and took off through the underbrush at incredible speed. The way it moved was like nothing I'd ever seen, using its long arms almost like extra legs to propel itself forward in huge bounds. We stumbled after it, struggling to keep up. I don't know what we thought we were going to do if we caught it, but we couldn't just let it disappear. As we ran, I noticed it was grabbing leafy maple branches, using them to cover its back trail. It was deliberately obscuring its tracks. The level of intelligence that implied was terrifying. After a few minutes of crashing through the woods, we lost sight of it completely. The forest fell silent again, as if nothing had happened. Jake and I looked at each other, panting and wide-eyed. Did you see that?" I managed to gasp out. Jake just nodded, his face pale. "What the hell was it? Some kind of mutant bear?" I shook my head. Bears don't move like that, and they sure as hell don't try to cover their tracks. We spent the next hour scouring the area for any sign of the creature, tracks, fur, anything, but it was like it had vanished into thin air. The only evidence we had was a few broken branches high up in the trees where it must have pushed through. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of what we'd seen started to sink in. This wasn't just some weird animal. This was something unknown to science, something that shouldn't exist. We debated whether to report it to the rangers or police, but who would believe us? We'd sound like a couple of drunk idiots making up stories, and a small part of me was scared of what might happen if people did believe us. Would the woods be swarming with hunters and researchers, destroying the creature's habitat? Or worse, trying to capture or kill it? In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves. We cut our trip short and headed back to town, both of us jumping at every snapping twig or rustle in the bushes. I've never felt so small and vulnerable in the woods before. It's been almost 40 years, and I still think about that day all the time. Jake and I don't talk about it much anymore. I think we both worry that the other will start to doubt the memory if we dissect it too much. But I know what I saw. I've done a lot of research over the years, trying to make sense of it. Read every Bigfoot encounter I could find. And yeah, I know how that sounds. I used to laugh at those stories too, but after what I saw, I can't discount them anymore. The description matches a lot of other sightings in the Pacific Northwest. The height, the grey fur, the long arms. The intelligence and deliberate track obscuring has been reported by others too. It's both comforting and terrifying to know we're not alone in what we experienced. I still go hunting, but never in that part of King County. And I'm a lot more cautious in the woods now. I'm always scanning the trees, half expecting to see that massive shape again. Part of me hopes I do, to prove to myself once and for all that it was real. But a bigger part hopes I never encounter anything like that again. I don't know what's out there in our forests, but I know the world is a whole lot stranger and more mysterious than most people realize. And sometimes, ignorance really is bliss. Story 20. I was used to being home alone, so I didn't think much of it at first. Our house was pretty isolated, at the end of a long dirt road surrounded by dense forest. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd come home from school, make myself dinner, do some homework, maybe watch some TV. It was actually kind of nice having the place to myself, but everything changed on that fourth night. I had gone to bed around 11 p.m. as usual. I remember waking up suddenly around 3 a.m., my heart racing, though I wasn't sure why. The house was dead silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. As I laid there trying to calm down, I heard a soft noise outside my window, like something brushing against the side of the house. My bedroom was on the second floor, so at first I told myself it was just a tree branch in the wind. But then I saw it, a dark shape moving past my window. I froze, unable to breathe or move. The shape paused, and I swear I saw two gleaming eyes peering in at me through the glass. It wasn't human. The head was too large, oddly shaped. And it was massive, filling most of the window frame. A jolt of terror shot through me as I realized whatever it was had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall to be looking in my second-story window like that. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, the shape moved away. I heard heavy footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves in our yard, moving incredibly fast. Then a loud crash as it crashed through the underbrush at the edge of the forest. I laid there paralyzed for several minutes, afraid to move. When I finally worked up the courage to get up and look outside, the yard was empty. But I could see a path of bent grass and disturbed leaves leading into the woods. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed with all the lights on, jumping at every little noise. When morning finally came, I called my older brother who lived about 30 minutes away on the mainland. I tried to explain what had happened, but I was still so shaken up I could barely get the words out. He must have heard the fear in my voice because he insisted on coming over right away to check things out. When he got there, we walked around the outside of the house. There were some scuff marks on the siding below my window, but nothing definitive. We followed the path of bent vegetation into the woods a little ways. The trail of disturbed leaves and snapped twigs continued deeper in, but we didn't want to go too far. My brother tried to reassure me it was probably just a bear or something, but I could tell he was unsettled too. Whatever it was moved way too fast to be a bear. And the way it had peered in my window with those glowing eyes, it felt almost intelligent, predatory, like it knew exactly what it was doing. I ended up staying at my brother's place for the next few nights. I just couldn't bring myself to be alone in that house again. But even at his apartment in town, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept imagining I saw dark shapes moving at the edge of my vision, or heard heavy breathing outside the windows at night. When my parents got back the following week, I tried to tell them what had happened, but of course they were skeptical. They checked around the property but didn't find any obvious signs of intruders. My dad said the marks on the siding were probably just from a raccoon or something. I wanted to believe that, to convince myself it had all been my imagination, just a bad dream. But deep down, I knew what I saw was real. In the weeks and months that followed, I had terrible nightmares about glowing eyes watching me through windows. I begged my parents to let me change bedrooms, to sleep on the first floor. Even after I went away to college the next year, I dreaded coming home for breaks. I'd lay awake at night, afraid to look at the windows, wondering if that thing was still out there in the woods, waiting. It's been over 35 years now, and I've never seen anything like that again. I've mostly convinced myself it must have been some kind of animal, maybe a particularly large bear. The human mind can play tricks on you in the dark, after all. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still get that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I'm being watched. And for a split second, I'll catch a glimpse of movement outside, a flash of gleaming eyes in the darkness. I've never told many people about what happened that night. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw. And a part of me will always wonder, what was that thing? And is it still out there somewhere, prowling the forests of Harstein Island on dark winter nights? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. But I do know one thing. I'll never forget that terrifying encounter, or the way it changed how I see the world. There are things out there in the darkness that defy explanation, things that most people will never see or believe in, but they're real, and they're watching. Story 21. I'll never forget that day in June 1985. Me and a couple buddies were out in Clark County, Washington, doing some clay pigeon shooting to kill time on a Saturday afternoon. It was a hot summer day, and we'd driven out to this secluded spot in the woods where we could shoot without bothering anyone. We'd been out there for a couple hours, taking turns launching the clay pigeons and trying to nail them out of the air. It was all fun and games, just us guys hanging out, talking shit, and enjoying the nice weather. Little did we know our relaxing day was about to take a terrifying turn. It was getting on towards late afternoon, maybe 4 or 5 o'clock. The shadows were starting to get long as the sun dipped lower. We were thinking about packing it in soon and heading back into town to grab some beers. I remember I had just taken my turn shooting and was reloading my shotgun when it happened. Out of nowhere, this ungodly sound ripped through the air. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, this deep, guttural roar that seemed to go on forever. The sheer volume of it was insane. It felt like it was vibrating my whole body. We all froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. What the hell was that? My first thought was maybe a bear, but I'd heard bear sounds before, and this was way bigger, way more primal. It didn't sound like any animal I knew of. There was dead silence for a few seconds after the roar faded. Then we heard crashing sounds coming from the woods, like something big moving through the underbrush. That's when panic set in. Without a word, we all took off, sprinting for the truck. I've never run so fast in my life. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I kept imagining some huge monster bursting out of the trees behind us. We piled into the truck, fumbling with shaky hands to get the key in the ignition. As we peeled out of there, tires spitting gravel, I glanced in the rearview mirror. I swear I saw movement in the tree line, something massive and dark. But it was only for a split second before we rounded a bend in the road. We barely spoke on the drive back, all of us trying to process what had just happened. When we got back to town, we went straight to a bar and ordered shots. We needed something to calm our nerves. As we sat there, we started talking it through, trying to figure out what it could have been. A bear, a mountain lion. But we all agreed. That sound was like nothing we'd ever heard before. It was almost human, but not quite. And so unbelievably loud and powerful. For weeks after, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear that roar again. I kept imagining what kind of creature could make a sound like that. Sometimes I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I'd heard it again outside my window. We never went back to that spot to shoot. In fact, I pretty much gave up hunting and going into the deep woods altogether after that. It just didn't feel safe anymore, knowing something like that was out there. Months went by, and the memory started to fade a bit. I was able to convince myself that maybe we'd just freaked ourselves out, that it probably wasn't as scary as we remembered. Then one night, I was flipping channels and came across some documentary about Bigfoot. I almost changed it. I'd never really bought into that stuff. But then they played this audio recording, supposedly of a Bigfoot call. I felt the blood drain from my face. The hair on my arms stood up. It was the exact same sound we'd heard that day, that deep, resonant roar that seemed to shake the air itself. There was no mistaking it. I called up my buddies right away. They'd seen it too. We were all shaken, realizing that what we'd encountered that day was real. It wasn't just our imagination or some known animal. We'd come face to face, or at least ear to ear, with something that wasn't supposed to exist. To this day, I get chills thinking about it. I've never told many people this story. Who would believe it? But I know what I heard. And I know there's something out there in those woods that defies explanation. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I still hear that roar echoing in my head. And I wonder, what if we hadn't run that day? What if we'd stuck around or gone to investigate? Would we have seen it? Part of me is glad we'll never know, but another part can't help but be curious. What exactly was out there in those woods? And is it still there, waiting to be discovered? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. But I do know one thing. I'll never forget that sound as long as I live. It was the sound of the impossible becoming real, of the world suddenly becoming a much bigger, scarier place than I ever imagined. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear it echoing through the trees. Story 22. I was just 17 that summer of '85, working at the Beacon Rock golf course to earn some cash before senior year. It was a pretty sweet gig, beautiful views of the Columbia River Gorge, fresh air, and getting paid to hang out on a golf course all day. June 15th started out like any other day. The course was busy with weekend golfers, and I was helping out wherever needed, manning the pro shop, driving the beverage cart, that kind of thing. Around 3 p.m., an older gentleman came into the shop looking flustered. He'd shanked a drive into the woods on the 7th hole and couldn't find his ball. Normally we'd just give them a new one and send them on their way, but this guy was insistent. It was some fancy collector's ball he'd just bought. My manager gave me a look, so I offered to go help him search. We headed out to the 7th, a long par 5 that runs along the edge of the forest. The guy pointed to where he thought it went in, and I told him I'd take a look. I'd done this plenty of times before, so I wasn't worried about traipsing into the trees a bit. As I pushed through the first layer of underbrush, the sounds of the golf course quickly faded away. It was notably cooler and darker under the thick canopy. I scanned the ground, figuring the ball couldn't have gone in too deep. After a few minutes of searching, I was about to give up when I caught a whiff of something foul. It was like rotting meat mixed with wet dog, absolutely putrid. I froze, suddenly very aware of how quiet it was. No birds, no rustling leaves, just dead silence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot. Slowly, I raised my eyes from the forest floor. There it was, about 12 feet away, partially hidden behind a massive Douglas fir. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. Broad shoulders, massively muscular. But it was the fur that short-circuited my mind. Light brown on the limbs, getting darker towards the chest until it was nearly black. This was no bear. Bears don't stand upright like that. Bears don't have arms that long, hanging almost to the knees. And bears sure as hell don't have faces that look almost human. Its eyes locked onto mine, deep-set, intelligent eyes that bored into my soul. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Pure terror had stolen my voice. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then it moved. Sweet Jesus, the way it moved. One moment it was there, the next it was halfway up the hill behind it. No sound except for the occasional snap of a branch. It was like a living shadow, flowing through the trees with impossible grace for something so large. My paralysis finally broke. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with none of the creature's silent agility. Branches whipped my face, roots tried to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing it chasing me. I burst out of the tree line onto the fairway, gasping for breath. The golfer was still there, looking annoyed. "Did you find it?" he asked. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head and walked quickly back to the clubhouse, my legs trembling. For the rest of my shift, I was a wreck. I jumped at every sound, every shadow. My co-workers asked if I was okay, but I brushed them off. What could I say? That I saw Bigfoot? They'd think I was crazy or on drugs. When my dad picked me up that evening, he immediately noticed something was off. "Rough day, kiddo?" he asked. I almost told him then, almost spilled everything, but I couldn't. I mumbled something about being tired and stared out the window the whole drive home. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes staring back at me. I kept hearing phantom noises outside my window, convinced it had followed me home. But morning came, and life went on. I never told anyone what I saw that day. Not my parents, not my friends, no one. Who would believe me? But I've carried it with me all these years. I've read every article, watched every documentary about Bigfoot sightings. I've analyzed that encounter 1,000 times in my head. Was it real? Did I imagine it? If it was real, why me? Why there? I don't work at the golf course anymore. Haven't set foot there since that summer, if I'm honest. I avoid hiking or camping. Being in the woods makes my skin crawl now. Sometimes I think about going back, trying to find some evidence. But then I remember the way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, and I know it's better left alone. I'm 55 now, and I've never seen anything like it again. Part of me is grateful for that. But another part almost wishes I would, just to prove to myself that I'm not crazy, that what I saw that day was real. So that's my story. Believe it or don't, I've stopped caring what people think. I know what I saw, and somewhere out there, in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, I know it's still out there, watching, waiting. I just hope our paths never cross again. Story 23. This particular day started out normal enough. It was late winter, and there was still a good amount of snow on the ground. We'd driven out early in the morning, the sun just starting to peek over the mountains as we made our way down the winding forest roads. I remember being bundled up in my puffy jacket, breath fogging in the crisp air as we got out of the truck. We hiked a ways into this clearing, Dad pointing out different rock formations and explaining how they were formed. I was only half listening, more focused on keeping my feet from sinking too deep in the snow. That's when Dad suddenly stopped dead in his tracks, going completely silent, mid-sentence. I almost ran into him, not expecting the abrupt halt. "What's wrong, Dad?" I asked, peering around him to see what had caught his attention. That's when I saw them, enormous footprints in the snow leading from the tree line across the clearing. Now, I'd seen plenty of animal tracks before. We often came across deer prints, sometimes bear or mountain lion. But these were something else entirely. They were huge, easily 18 inches long, maybe even bigger. And they were deep, sinking way further into the snow than anything I'd ever seen before. Dad just stood there for a moment, staring. Then he stepped forward cautiously, crouching down to examine one of the prints more closely. I followed, my heart starting to race a little. Something about the way Dad was acting told me this wasn't normal. "Look at how deep these are," he murmured, more to himself than to me. He reached out and touched the edge of one print, and I could see his hand shaking slightly. "Whatever made these, it's big, really big." I swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of how quiet and isolated we were out here. "Like a bear," I suggested hopefully, even though I knew these weren't bear tracks. They were clearly bipedal, 2 distinct feet walking in a straight line. Dad shook his head slowly. "No, not a bear. These are, well, they look almost human, but impossibly large." He stood up then, and I watched as he deliberately placed his own boot next to one of the prints. Dad wasn't a small guy. He must have weighed close to 300 pounds back then. But his foot looked tiny compared to the mysterious track, barely covering half its length. "I couldn't make an impression this deep if I tried," he said, a note of awe and fear in his voice. "Not even jumping. Whatever left these tracks, it's got to weigh at least twice what I do." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I found myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see some massive creature watching us. The forest suddenly seemed much darker and more menacing. Should we follow them?" I asked hesitantly. Part of me was terrified at the idea, but another part was intensely curious. What could have possibly made tracks like these? Dad considered for a moment, then nodded. "We'll follow them a little ways, see where they lead. But we stay alert, okay? And if I say we turn back immediately. No arguments." I nodded vigorously, sticking close to Dad's side as we began to follow the trail of massive footprints. They led in a straight line across the clearing, eerily purposeful. It was like whatever made them knew exactly where it was going. As we walked, I couldn't help but notice how evenly spaced the prints were. The stride length was enormous, easily twice what my dad could manage. It sent my mind racing, trying to picture just how tall a creature would have to be to walk like this. We reached the other side of the clearing, where the tracks disappeared back into the dense forest. Dad paused at the tree line, peering into the shadows between the pines. I could see the internal debate playing out on his face, the desire to keep investigating warring with his instinct to keep me safe. That's when we heard it. A low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a roar. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, and it made every hair on my body stand on end. Dad's hand clamped down on my shoulder, and I could feel him trembling slightly. "We're leaving," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Now." I didn't argue. We turned and started walking quickly back the way we'd come, trying to keep our movements quiet and controlled despite the panic rising in my chest. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, terrified I'd see some massive shape emerging from the trees. We were about halfway across the clearing when we heard it again, that bone-chilling sound, closer this time. And then, the unmistakable crack of breaking branches, like something very large was moving through the forest behind us. "Run," Dad said, giving me a push. "Back to the truck. Go!" We took off, all pretense of stealth abandoned. I pumped my legs as hard as I could, struggling through the snow, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Dad was right behind me, and I could hear his labored breathing. I don't know if something was really chasing us, or if it was just our imaginations running wild. But in that moment, the fear was all too real. I've never run so hard in my life before or since. We practically fell into the truck, Dad fumbling with the keys as I slammed my door shut. The engine roared to life, and we peeled out onto the road, spraying snow and gravel. It wasn't until we were miles away, safely back on the main highway, that we finally started to calm down. Dad's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I was shaking like a leaf. What do you think that was? I finally managed to ask, my voice small and quavering. Dad was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, he said at last. I really don't know. But whatever it wasn't natural, wasn't anything I've ever seen or heard of before. We didn't talk much for the rest of the drive home. But that night, I overheard Dad on the phone with his brother, describing what we'd seen in hushed, urgent tones. I caught phrases like Bigfoot and Sasquatch, things I'd heard of, but always thought were just stories. That day changed something in both of us. We still went out prospecting after that, but never in that area again. And Dad was always a little more cautious, a little more alert in the woods. As for me, well, I've never been able to shake the feeling that there are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation. I've told this story a few times over the years, usually met with skepticism or outright disbelief. And I get it. If I hadn't been there myself, I'm not sure I'd believe it either. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt that day. Those tracks in the snow, that sound that seemed to shake the very air. It was real. And sometimes, on dark nights when the wind is howling outside, I find myself wondering if whatever left those tracks is still out there, roaming the forests of Box Canyon Road. Story 24. I was just a kid back in '84, but that November changed everything for me. My dad worked as a logger in Chelan County, Washington, and sometimes he'd take me along on weekends when he had to check on things. I loved those trips. The smell of the pine trees, the crisp autumn air, the peacefulness of the forest. But that day was different. We drove out early on a Saturday morning, the mist still clinging to the trees as we bumped along the logging road in Dad's old pickup. It had rained the night before, leaving the ground soft and muddy. I remember the squelch of our boots as we got out to stretch our legs. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a weird depression in the mud, maybe from a fallen branch or something. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. It was unmistakably a footprint, but not like any I'd ever seen before. "Dad!" I called out, my voice cracking. "Come look at this!" He ambled over, coffee mug in hand, probably expecting to see a deer track or something ordinary. But when he saw what I was pointing at, he went dead silent. The footprint was massive, easily twice the size of my dad's work boots. But what really struck me was how wrong it looked. It was way too wide for its length, like someone had squished a normal foot sideways. Dad crouched down next to it, his face scrunched up in confusion. "What in the hell?" he muttered, setting his mug down to get a closer look. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the November air. What do you think made it, Dad?" I asked, already dreading the answer. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know, kiddo. I've never seen anything like this in all my years out here." We stood there for a while, just staring at this impossible print in the mud. I kept expecting Dad to laugh it off, to say it was just some trick of the light or a prank by one of the other loggers. But he didn't. He just kept looking at it with this worried expression I'd never seen on him before. Should we tell someone?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad straightened up, running a hand through his hair. "Who would we tell? The sheriff? They'd think we were nuts." He sighed deeply. "No, let's just finish up here and head home." But I couldn't let it go. As we walked back to the truck, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see some monstrous creature lumbering out of the trees. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Dad tried to act normal, showing me how to check the equipment and talking about mundane things. but I could tell his mind was elsewhere. On the drive home, the silence in the cab was deafening. I wanted to ask him a million questions, but the words stuck in my throat. It wasn't until we were almost home that he finally spoke up. "Listen, son," he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "What we saw today, it's best we keep it to ourselves, okay? People wouldn't understand." I nodded, relieved that he was at least acknowledging it had happened. "But Dad, what if it's still out there? What if—" He cut me off gently. "We don't know what it was. Could have been anything. No sense in getting all worked up over it." But I could tell he was worried. Over the next few weeks I noticed him checking the locks more carefully at night, peering out into the darkness before closing the curtains. And he never took me out to that part of the woods again. Years passed, and life went on. I grew up, moved away for college, started a career of my own. But I never forgot that day. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I'd find myself thinking about that strange footprint in the mud. I'd scour the internet for similar stories, read every book I could find on unexplained phenomena in the Pacific Northwest. But nothing ever quite matched what we'd seen. I tried bringing it up to Dad a few times over the years, but he'd always change the subject. It wasn't until much later, when he was in the hospital with cancer, that he finally opened up about it. "You remember that day, don't you?" he asked me, his voice weak, but his eyes sharp as ever. "Out on the logging road." I nodded, surprised he'd brought it up after all this time. "Yeah, Dad, I remember." He was quiet for a moment, staring out the hospital window. "I lied to you that day," he said finally, "when I said I'd never seen anything like it before." My heart started racing. "What do you mean?" He turned to look at me, his face deadly serious. "About a month before that, I was out there alone doing a night check. Heard something moving in the trees. Thought it was a bear at first, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "It was big, whatever it was. Stood on two legs. I only saw it for a second before it disappeared into the darkness. But those footprints, they were the same as the one we found that day. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Why didn't you ever say anything?" He sighed heavily. What was I supposed to say? That I saw some kind of monster in the woods? I had a family to support, a reputation to maintain. Nobody would have believed me anyway. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of his confession hanging between us. Finally, I asked the question that had been burning in my mind for decades. "What do you think it was, Dad? Really?" He closed his eyes, looking suddenly very old and tired. "I don't know, son. And that's what scares me the most. All these years, all the time I spent in those woods, and there was something out there I couldn't explain. Something that shouldn't exist." Dad passed away a few days later, taking whatever else he might have known to the grave. But his words that day in the hospital reignited my obsession with what we'd seen. I've spent countless hours researching, reaching out to others who've had similar experiences in the area. And while I've never found a definitive answer, I've come to realize that there are things in this world that defy explanation. That footprint in the mud wasn't just a bizarre anomaly. It was a glimpse into something beyond our understanding, a reminder that the world is far stranger and more mysterious than we'd like to believe. And sometimes late at night, when the wind rustles through the trees outside my window, I can't help but wonder, is it still out there, lurking in the shadows of Shiland County, waiting to be discovered again? I may never know the truth about what we saw that day, but I do know this. That single footprint left an indelible mark on my life, a constant reminder that there are mysteries in this world that go far beyond our comprehension. And while that thought used to terrify me, now I find it oddly comforting. It means there's still magic in the world, still things left to discover. And maybe, just maybe, one day we'll find the answers we've been looking for all along. Story 25. As I lay there trying to calm my racing pulse, I heard a faint noise outside my bedroom window. Straining my ears, I could make out what sounded like heavy breathing and slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the frosty ground. A chill ran down my spine. We lived in a pretty remote area, surrounded by dense forest. Who or what could be lurking outside at this hour? Summoning my courage, I crept out of bed and cautiously approached the window. That's when I saw it. A massive dark silhouette, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, hunched over and peering directly into my room. I froze in terror, hardly daring to breathe. The creature's head was enormous and seemed to be covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes glinted in the moonlight as it stared intently through the glass. Suddenly, as if sensing it had been spotted, the thing bolted with incredible speed. It covered the length of our large yard in just a few impossibly long strides, crashing through the underbrush at the forest's edge. The sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves faded as it disappeared into the woods. But I remained rooted to the spot, trembling uncontrollably. What the hell had I just seen? It was far too large and fast to be a person, and the way it moved was unlike any animal I'd ever encountered. As the initial shock began to wear off, I fumbled for the bedside lamp and flicked it on, desperate to dispel the darkness. I didn't sleep another wink that night, jumping at every little sound and constantly checking the window. When dawn finally broke, I ventured outside to investigate. There, in the frost-covered grass, were a set of enormous footprints, easily 15 inches long. They led from the woods right up to my window before veering off again. I snapped a few Polaroids of the prints before they could melt away. With shaking hands, I tried calling my parents, but couldn't reach them. I needed to get off this island, at least for a few days until they returned. I packed an overnight bag and took the ferry to the mainland, seeking refuge at my older brother's place in Shelton. But even there, miles away from our isolated home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced out a window or walked to my car, the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up. More than once I caught glimpses of something large moving in the shadows, always at the edge of my peripheral vision. I confided in my brother about what I'd seen, showing him the Polaroids. He was skeptical at first, suggesting it was probably just a bear, but the sheer size of those footprints gave him pause. We pored over local news reports and wildlife bulletins, searching for any similar sightings or explanations. The closest match we found were some vague accounts of a creature locals referred to as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I'd always dismissed those stories as rural legends, but after what I'd experienced, I wasn't so sure anymore. The raw fear I'd felt in that moment, staring into those intelligent, somehow human-like eyes, it was burned into my memory. Each night I tossed and turned, plagued by vivid nightmares. In my dreams, I was back in my bedroom on the island. But this time, the creature didn't flee. Instead, it smashed through the window, reaching for me with massive, hairy hands. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing. During the day, I was constantly on edge, startling easily at sudden movements or sounds. My brother started to worry about my mental state. When my parents finally returned home a few days later, I reluctantly went back to the island with them. I tried to explain what had happened, but they seemed doubtful. Dad checked around the property but found no signs of any intruder. Mom suggested my imagination had simply run wild being alone in the house. But I knew what I'd seen was real. Those footprints were proof, even if they had melted away by now. In the weeks that followed, I rarely left the house after dark. I kept all the curtains tightly drawn and quadruple-checked the locks before bed. But no matter how secure I tried to make myself feel, that sense of being watched never fully went away. Sometimes at night I'd hear heavy footsteps circling the house or catch a whiff of a musky, animal-like odor drifting through my window. But whenever I worked up the nerve to look outside, there was never anything there. As the initial terror faded, my fear began to mix with an odd sort of curiosity. What exactly was this creature? Why had it come to our island? Was it just passing through, or had it always been there, hidden in the vast stretches of wilderness? I started researching cryptozoology and Bigfoot lore, devouring every book and article I could find on the subject. So many of the descriptions matched what I'd seen: the massive size, the inhuman speed, the eerily intelligent gaze. But solid proof remained elusive. For every compelling eyewitness account, there were a dozen obvious hoaxes. I knew what I'd experienced was real, but how could I ever prove it to anyone else? As the years passed, my encounter began to feel more like a bizarre dream than reality. I eventually left the island for college on the mainland, eager to put some distance between myself and those haunted woods. But even now, decades later, I still find myself scanning the tree line whenever I visit my childhood home. That lingering feeling of being observed has never fully faded. I don't know if I'll ever understand exactly what happened that winter night in 1984. Was it truly a Bigfoot, or some other as-yet undiscovered species, or simply a case of an overactive imagination mixed with isolation and darkness? All I know for certain is that it fundamentally changed how I view the world around me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are still profound mysteries lurking in the wilderness, defying easy explanation. I've never publicly shared my story before now. For years I worried people would think I was crazy or attention-seeking, but I feel compelled to finally break my silence, in hopes that others who've had similar experiences might feel less alone. Whatever that creature was, I'm convinced it's still out there somewhere in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Perhaps one day concrete evidence will emerge to prove its existence. Until then, I'll continue to wonder about that night, and to keep a watchful eye on the shadows.